Some books whisper, others just breathe. All of them remember what we tidy.
Not outrage, not spectacle. Competence, the kind that teaches a city to breathe.
For the next 2 hours, you'll have what you rarely get. A story that holds you, and the quiet that lets you sleep.
Continuity is a lock. Relief is its decoy. Listen for consent, not applause.
If they keep asking, perhaps we haven't explained the hinge.
Openings aren't loud, they're courteous. The world clicks, and a century sits down. Likeness reassures. But it's the cuff scent that tells you who's writing the room.
Breathe slowly. Keep your own time. Press play, and let the room's quiet teach you how to rest.
Settle in, dim the lights, and let the noise fall away. If a detail brushes against a memory, don't chase it, just note it. Keep a small notebook by your side. Tonight, we're not hunting monsters. We're listening for what history forgot. When you're ready, take a slow breath and step with me onto the domes. They told us silence was sacred, but the first thing they taught me was how to make it. You pinch the candle wick between two wet fingers and turn your wrist like twisting a key in a lock. The flame bows and dies without smoke, and the room inhales your quiet. I remember the taste of it like coins and old thunder, like breath held too long under a stone staircase. I remember my own heartbeat sounding unlit and obedient inside my ribs. I remember the key they pressed into my palm, thin as a thorn and warm as a warning. The tooth on that key was shaped like a letter. You would think the letter stood for a name. It did not. It stood for a date. I am telling you this because I no longer keep dates the way they taught me. I keep them the way the sky does imperfectly, with drift and pulse and the occasional refusal. I used to be one of the night guard, the men who walk the spines of the domes while Rome sleeps. If you stood on the cobbles and looked up at midnight, you would see nothing but copper and moonlight, but there is a narrow world up there, cut from rails and gutters, wind and prayer, line and line and line, like ribs and rosary. We learned the pace of it, the count of it, the little rituals that keep a city from remembering too much at once. We wore plain cassocks and soft shoes, and carried a ring of keys like a rosary mistakes itself for a weapon. In the ledgers, they called us custodes noctis, keepers of the night. In the mouths of boys daring each other in the alleyways, we were witchers. We never corrected them. The truth is simpler and more indecent. We were janitors of memory. On my first night, the archivist made me walk without looking down. Put your faith on the line, he said, and it was not a metaphor. There is a line sorted into the copper, thin as a vein. Lightning put it there long before we were born, and the city learned to use it the way a harp learns the hand that plucks it. I followed that vein east to west across the curve of the roof, the wind trying to fold me into a hymn. The bells below were sleeved. This is a trick you will not find in any manual. You unhook the clapper and wrap it in velvet so the city keeps time without sound. For years, it slept better that way. We walked to a door the color of wet ash. There is no floor beneath it, only a drop and the slow kindness of air. The archivist touched the lintel like a man greeting an old dog. Porta non nata, he said, the door unborn. The name has the bad taste of a joke told during a funeral. He did not smile. When this door opens, a memory will flinch. We will close it before anything decides to remember differently. Back then, I still believed in clean categories. sacred and profane, inside and out, then and now. The archive taught me otherwise. The archive teaches through smell, through texture, through the way your eyes start watering in rooms that have no dust. The archive has an outer face, the one scholars tour with their white gloves and soft voices, and it has a second face. Under that, the face that makes scholars want to scratch. We call it Archivum Umbrae, the shadow archive, not because it is evil, but because it is obedient to light. It exists in the exact inverse of the hours when light is honest. You reach it by climbing the wrong direction first up, then down through the clock face that never moves, then deeper by a spiral the color of a bruise. The air changes there. It turns heavy and sweet, like a chapel after 100 candles have agreed to die at once. The Shadow Archive uses a different alphabet. The letters look familiar until you notice they are counting you. I signed an oath I cannot reproduce here because the letters would not mean the same thing to you. They did not mean the same thing to me from one week to the next. The ink was thicker than ink should be, and it stuck to the quill with a loyalty that felt personal. When I lifted the pen, the last drop threaded a line between paper and nib, and I lifted my hand higher and it refused to break. The archivist blew gently, and the thread broke like a spider web in winter. He nodded, as if something about my compliance pleased him. "Welcome," he said. "You will find the nights shorter and the years longer from now on. And of this. And he made of this. He placed a book in front of me. I remember the weight of it, like a small, trained animal. The title was stamped in iron leaf that had eaten a little way into the leather. Liber Siderum Obedientium. The Book of Obedient Stars. I had studied astronomy. I thought this would be harmless. He made me read it aloud until the Latin grew into something smaller and more specific, the way names do when spoken softly. It was not a map of the sky. It was a map of how the sky was used, each constellation paired to an edict, each planet to a motion of the wrist, each retrograde to a superstition shaped like a hinge. When we turned the pages, the room made a sound like frost thinking about glass. The senior guards taught me the toolkit. We carried a phial of water drawn from a cistern that sees the moon but never the sun. We carried a length of red thread that refused knots and remembered every hand that had touched it. We carried a key for every book in the chained library, though we did not call it that out loud. Out loud, we called it the Room of Gentle Things, because the ironwork was tender and elaborate, and tenderness is cheaper than locks when you are trying to keep the curious from asking the right questions. We carried a bell clapper wrapped in velvet. We carried a pencil whose lead could only write numbers, even when asked nicely for words. We carried a tin of soot mixed with beeswax for sealing the door unborn. We carried a short prayer that could be said forward or backward without changing what it did to the air. You wanted monsters. There are none. The world is worse and kinder than that. There are only mechanisms, and the people who become them. On the third week, I was taken to the chained library. The chain is not a metaphor. It's quicker to say what the chains are not. Not crude, not punitive, not accidental. They are braided like hair you would not cut, and warm the way metal gets when it knows the room. Every shackle ends in an individualized key mouth, like a face that expects a particular kiss. Don't be romantic. The kiss is a bite. The first book I unlocked sighed like a pillow. The second rasped its pages together like teeth. The third did nothing at all, and so we respected it. There is a gospel in there, with no title on its spine. The margins are pricked with needle holes, as if the parchment had tried to feel its way out of its own story. The ink is the color of waking up too early. When you read it, it translates itself into the voice of the person who taught you to pray. For me, that was my mother, and it humbled me into stillness the way only childhood can. I read until I realized the sentences kept rearranging themselves to hide a name. I put my thumb on the text to stop it moving. The name slid away under my nail like a small fish. Good, the archivist said. You felt it. If you feel it, you can file it. We filed absences as if they were objects. There is a way to index what is not there. You make a card for the empty shelf and give it a number, and every time you notice you are not noticing something, you cross-reference yourself. This is how you keep order in a house that edits itself. Dust helps. Dust tells the truth about continuance. We learn to read dust as other men read scripture. A saint's niche, scrubbed clean by order but still shining with the attention of 10,000 hands. A step worn thin by feet that the ledger has erased. We wrote it down, and then the archivist drew a neat black line through my entry and wrote another name above it in his precise hand. Do not worry, he said. You remember it. The book remembers you remember it. That is sufficient. He showed me the ledger of popes. It has a smell like apples stored too long. Between 2 centuries lies a wafer-thin parcel of parchment, 3 pages sewn in with a thread you can see only if you are very tired. They list 3 men who were pope in a season the calendar does not keep. Next to each name is an instrument, a compass, a razor, a comb. I asked what that meant. He turned the page and used his finger to show me the motion of the wrist that trims spring into late winter. Governess, he said, which is not a word in any language I know, and yet I know what it means. It is the act of teaching the world how to behave properly in a room. You want dates. I cannot give you dates because the thread will wrap around my fingers and the ink will insist on counting. So let me give you textures. The planetarium in the vault, its orrery, is bone, white as a corrected error. It turns smoother than prayer and clicks like a good pair of shears. The stars are small beads of something that refuses to melt, and they are strung on copper wires that smell like rain before it chooses a city. When you turn it, you can feel the weight of martyrdoms, aligning with equinoxes, the way a lock expects the right key. I put my fingers on the ring, and the archivist put his hand lightly over mine. Now, he said, and the entire room became 5 degrees colder. Somewhere above us, a bell rang in a building that never had a bell. The sound was not a sound, it was a permission. Training on the roof is not athletic, it is attentional. You learn the walking pace that leaves the wind uninterested in you. 7 paces along the meridian, scored by lightning, touch the iron cross with bare fingers so your bones remember the taste of metal. Whisper the psalm that tastes of salt, because salt convinces water to tell the truth. After that, the little door with no floor beneath it. You look at it until you stop wanting to look at it. You learn the feeling of the world tightening 1 notch when it opens. You learn the difference between smoke that curls clockwise and smoke that drifts the other way. A clockwise curl means the story has agreed to wear the clothes laid out for it. Counterclockwise means a tailor somewhere will run out of thread and not know why. The first erasure I saw was almost tender. We had just resealed the door, beeswax and soot smoothed under the heel of the hand until the seam looked like an old smile. The city exhaled the way a reader does when a difficult paragraph finally sits down and behaves. We coiled the red thread back into its tin. I wrote the entry. Date, weather, the color of the moonlight. You laugh, but it matters. The way the pigeons had refused to sleep on the Marian statue facing east, which usually meant a small adjustment somewhere in the diocesan archives. I handed the pencil to the archivist. He crossed out my name, wrote a different name above it, and tapped the margin twice. We tidy as we go, he said, and I looked at the square below, where a woman was lifting a child to touch a fountain. The child laughed like a bell. When the sound reached us, it wore velvet. I began to notice little seams. The sermon that was remembered by 6 people in 7 different ways, none of them fitting together. The fresco that had always contained a 4th angel, because there was no room for a 4th angel. The plaque outside a chapel with a date that blinked if you stared without blinking. The way the city sometimes woke up with a word in its mouth from a language it had never spoken, and then spent the day trying to cough it up politely. These are drafts, the archivist said. We smooth them at night. I asked why we needed smoothing. He gave me the smallest piece of truth I think a man like him can give without hurting himself. Because it is kinder, he said. Because people sleep better when the night is curated. For a while I believed him. Because belief is a habit you don't know you are wearing until you try to take it off and discover the buttons are on the wrong side for your hands. I told myself that we were gardeners of memory, pruning away the branches that would tear the trellis down. But pruning becomes a style if you are not careful, and a style becomes a conviction, and conviction is only a step away from appetite. If you are careful, you can feel the step before you take it. The care is exhausting. The Shadow Archive does not pretend to be holy. It pretends to be correct. It is dressed in the politeness of indexes and the mercy of cross-references. There is a tenderness in how it clips the world to size. There is also a cruelty, even if it is a tidy one. I learned the word obducta obscured. It was used for maps sewn into other books so that anyone shelving them by spine would never suspect they carried a second geography. I found pilgrim routes traced over constellations, as if the sky were a script you could walk. I found a chart of bells, their names, their weights, their temperaments, and next to each, a list of human temperaments they could soothe. I found a cupboard of candlesticks, labeled with parts of the day that no longer exist. I found indulgences for time, small slips of vellum promising a remission of minutes for those who had lost days to grief. I found a drawer of saints' names puckered out of the ledger, so neatly the page forgave the theft. We filed the holes as if they were coins. Sometimes the archive listened to us. We would be making a catalog card for an absence, and the air would thicken very gently, like water learning ice, and a different absence would present itself, shy and precise, and we would stand aside for it the way you stand aside, for a person who knows the way through a narrow room. I do not know how to explain this without sounding as if I am flattering my own superstition. The truth is that the archive is how the city keeps secrets from itself, and someone must oil the hinges. I oil them no longer. This is why I am speaking now. I prefer to leave the squeak where I find it. The night it happened, no, that is later. If I tell you about the storm now, if I give you the mirror and the portraits that blink and the iron clapper wrapped in thread that refuses knots, you will think this confession is about thunder. It is not. Thunder is theatrical. What broke me was gentle. It was the way a room corrected a single letter and turned a sorrow I had been carrying for years into a different, more fashionable sorrow. It was the way the gospel with my mother's voice wasn't there one day, and in its place was a space shaped exactly like my belief, and some part of me said, "Thank you. I want you to understand the texture of how a life becomes elastic." A man asks you to make notes in a ledger with a pencil that writes only numbers. You write down the weather as a sequence, the moon as a fraction, your pulse as an integer approximating trust. You hand it back and see that your name has learned to be removed. You learn to admire the neatness. You learn to conflate neatness with goodness. When the door unborn opens and your breath shortens as if the world has decided to wear a tighter garment, you speak the prayer that can be said forward or backward. You press wax into a seam. You go home. You sleep. You wake. A statue in a square seems to have always looked the way it looks now. The pigeons disagree, but the pigeons are not good witnesses. Your mother's voice is not in the gospel, but your mother's voice is in your head telling you to go to work, and so you do. If you are patient with me, I will give you the things you can hold. The smell of beeswax when soot is folded into it with the heel of a hand. The way the copper skin of the dome warms faster than stone when the first light considers dawn. The trip and catch of your foot where the meridian knits two sheets of metal, and the tiny jolt of gratitude that your body gives you for not falling. The quiet of a bell that has been persuaded to keep its counsel. The weight of the key ring, how it is heavier in your pocket than in your palm, as if the pocket knows it is hiding something it has not agreed to hide. The look on the archivist's face when you ask him a question he is prepared to answer. Patient, almost paternal. The patience of a craftsman surrounded by apprentices who mistake the polish for the wood. "Why me?" I asked him once, in the smallest hour when men are most honest and the city is between decisions. He did not say it was because I was good or faithful or brave. He said, "Because you are obedient to detail." I took it as a compliment. I take it now as a warning cut into the foundations of my life. There were nights when the work felt like mercy. A monk in the quarter below walked in his sleep. We rearranged a footnote. He woke before he reached the rail. A baby would not stop crying. We sleeved the bell, and the child sighed into the heavy velvet of it. A scholar fell ill on a paragraph, unable to finish a thought because the thought was braided to a wrong date. We moved the braid, and he wrote until his hand shook, and then slept with the ink drying gentle on his knuckles. I held these things like coins in my mouth, and believed I was rich. And then, while cataloging a cabinet of calendars, little pocket things with saints' names and tiny moons, I found a run that skipped a week that mattered to me more than any other week in my life. You know the kind of week I mean. Yours will be different. The calendar had excused itself from keeping it, and in the margin was written a beautiful reason about floods and reform and agricultural prudence. It was a good reason. It was the kind of reason that makes a man feel like an adult in the presence of his own childhood. I sat with it a long time. Then I filed it. I felt the room relax around me, the way a room does when someone stops crying because they have decided their grief is untidy. That night on the domes, the wind brought salt from no sea I know. The city was not in danger. The city was asleep, polite and grateful. The door unborn kept its counsel. We did not open it. We made a round, counted 7, touched metal, whispered salt. We went home. I should have slept. I did not. I counted the stars with the wrong names and waited to see if any of them would answer to the names they had had the night before. They twitched, the way a dog twitches when dreaming of running. I counted again. The numbers came slower, as if they were reluctant to be used. When I told the archivist I was tired, he smiled and poured water over my hands from the moon cistern. "It is not fatigue," he said. "It is the recognition of a craft. The world is heavy because it is well made." He turned the bone orrery with 2 fingers. The room cooled. Somewhere, a bell tested the air like a tongue. You must learn to love the click. Perhaps this is the heart of it. The click. Locks are beautiful. Keys are beautiful. The human mind loves the relief of fit. You give a hinge its pin, and it forgives you for the door. I loved it, until I noticed that every click left a little bruise on the edge of my thoughts. And the bruises learned each other's names. And one night, they sat together and sang softly, and their song sounded very much like my mother, and the gospel was not there to tell me I was making a mistake. You wanted a confession. This is it, plain as I can tell it without the room correcting me. I was obedient to detail. I made the city easier on itself. I believed that mercy and management were the same thing. I believed that if we used the sky properly, the days would wear better and the nights would not snag. I believed that saints are a kind of stitch. I believed that if we drew a line of red thread against the dark would consent to be bordered. I believed that a neat ledger could keep a man from falling off a roof. Some of these beliefs are still true. Most of them are just tidy. If you are still with me, keep a small notebook by your side. When a detail brushes against a memory, do not chase it. Note it. That is what we did before we learned how to chase. That is what I do now. In the slow hours when I can hear my own thought without its vestments, I note the little disobediences, the way the pigeons refuse a statue they adored yesterday, the way the light from the street lamp arrives 1 heartbeat sooner on a Tuesday, the way a bridge smells of rain when no rain has entered the city, the way a bell is quiet when you know it is ringing somewhere in the room where you cannot find it. These are not proofs. Proof is easy to bury where the ground is. Dates. These are roots. They push at foundations not because they are malicious, but because they want room for water. The archivist would want me to end this neatly, with a 5-syllable word that absolves both of us from this gentle disobedience. I cannot. I can tell you that the door unborn will open again. As all doors do, this is not a omen, but a mechanical fact. I can tell you that the city sleeps better than it wakes, because waking requires remembering, and remembering is work. The body resents when it thinks it has paid its tithe. I can tell you that the night is not a monster. It is a curator with good hands and an appetite for sorrow. I can tell you that I am speaking now because a woman in a square looked at a fountain with the grief of someone who had misplaced her own birthday, and the fountain made a sound like a page turning, and I realized I had been turning the pages for her all my life. If you listen, you can hear the orrery turning in the next room. If you close your eyes, you can feel the click. If you open them, you will see your own handwriting on the margin of your day, and you will not remember writing it, and the letters will be numbers, and the number will be a date, and the date will be obedient, and you will be briefly so unbearably grateful for how well everything fits that you will sleep without dreaming. Do not be ashamed of that sleep. Tidy mercy has its place, and we all owe rent to the rooms that keep us. But wake gently. Keep the notebook. When the bell rings without sound, write down the angle of your shadow. If a statue looks at you as if remembering your face, let it. If a gospel is missing, do not search the shelf. Search your breath for the voice it took with it. When you touch an iron cross in the dark, feel for the coolness that is not metal but the idea of metal. These are small things. Small things make honest hinges. This is enough for tonight. The door unborn is quiet. The velvet is back on the clapper. The red thread is asleep in its tin. The archivist has not yet noticed that when he crossed out my name last, the ink refused, and the thin black line lifted gently from the page like smoke reconsidering its loyalty. I should sleep. Instead, I will sit in the window and watch the part of the sky that refuses to be obedient. If the stars answer to yesterday's names, I will tell you. If they don't, I will tell you that too. Either way, I am done filing the absence of what I love. Silence was not sacred. It was enforced. Tonight, at least, the enforcement is tired. And in the tiredness, a small breach, and in the breach, a voice like water saying my name in a room that has forgotten how to count, thinking, the domes do not sleep. They pretend, the way a cat pretends, eyes narrowed, tail motionless, a single whisker listening to the room. Copper keeps a kind of memory stone cannot. It warms fast, cools slow, and holds a day the way a palm holds the echo of a handle. When you step onto the first curve above the nave, you feel it, a hush that is not quiet but a reorganization of attention. Below, the city rehearses its arguments. Up here, every quarrel is a draft. We began each night the same way, with the count. 7 paces along the lightning seam. The seam looks like a scar a surgeon would be proud of, thin, white, deliberate. Lightning taught the city where to place the meridian, and we obeyed it like an old law that still pays its own taxes. I learned to set my feet exactly on the ribline so my weight would distribute into the earth, without making the roof remember me in the morning. The archivist said it as a joke the first time, and then not as a joke the second. The best guard leaves nothing for the pigeons to tell. The bell towers are the lungs. I did not know that until my 2nd month. By day they breathe the city. By night they breathe the sky. You do not ring a bell to make sound. You ring it to organize the air. We worked with sleeves, soft velvet pouches, cut to swallow a clapper whole. Each sleeve was stitched with a number that was not a number. We knew them by touch. The velvet had learned the fingerprints of the men who carried them. There is a tenderness to that, and a cruelty. I do not know how to separate them cleanly. Sleeving a bell is choreography. You open your palm flat to the iron and let the weight teach you humility. The older guard Taddeo, whose hands were scarred where calculation burned him, showed me the angle. 2 fingers to steady, 2 to coax, the thumb to promise the bell it will not be shamed in public. We spoke to them by their baptismal names, which would sound ridiculous to you if you heard them in daylight. At night they made a strict domestic sense. Bells are proud. They want to be useful. To ask them for silence is to ask for trust. The velvet helps. So does the prayer. That tastes of salt. The prayer is not long. The prayer is an integer disguised as mercy. It occupies the mouth the way a seed occupies soil. You cannot hurry it without teaching it to wilt. You hold the last syllable like a coin on your tongue, and let the bell feel that you are not there to steal its dignity. When you finish, the tower becomes a different architecture. The air hangs differently. The pigeons agree to treat the rafters as a law. The city below softens as if someone has smoothed the bedspreads of 10,000 strangers at once. From the south transept, there is a ladder that becomes a tunnel, that becomes a corridor with no walls, only suggestions of walls. The suggestion made by wind learning to take turns. We walked that corridor with our lanterns hooded, light bled to a disciplined drip. The lanterns themselves were small compromises. The glass is blown thin as excuses. The wick is cut to a cursor's width. The oil is pressed from olives that grew in a grove that only sees the moon. We were told never to let the lantern flame be seen from below. Pilgrims misunderstand evidence. The soul is clumsy when it thinks it is beholding a sign. At the midpoint of the eastern dome lies the cross brace we called the miserere. It creaks when the air is thinking about rain. We would pause there. Even the archivist paused. Rome spreads from that apex like a thesis. The rooftops lay themselves out as if to be examined, and the streets explain themselves patiently until they reach the river and become private again. From there you can hear 3 different versions of the same hymn if the wind is carrying properly: the public version in the nave, the private version in a cloistered courtyard, and the version the stones hum to themselves out of pure habit. The stones keep the beat more honestly than any choir. They are incapable of sarcasm. We checked the hinges. Rites are chores with a memory. The hinge named Theophilus liked to drink dew. We wiped it dry with cloth married to ash. The hinge named Agnes refused oil older than a week. We carried a vial sealed with wax that remembered Sunday. The hinge we did not name, no one admitted to knowing its name, sat in the mouth of the Porta non nata, and we touched it with the backs of our fingers only, the way you touch a sleeping child, to make sure breath keeps its promises. Sometimes the hinge felt warm with a warmth that was not mechanical. Those nights we stayed longer, I asked, as men ask when they think their curiosity is a merit. What is behind it? Nothing useful, Taddeo said. Which is to say, everything we protect has not learned to be useful yet. The archivist prefers metaphors that behave themselves. He said, behind it is a correction waiting for context. We measured the pressure with smoke. Not incense, incense is too proud. Smoke from beeswax folded with soot, pressed into the shape of a penny. You pinched it to make a little snake, and then taught the snake to be a question mark. If the curve held with its tail to the right, the night would go like good handwriting. If the tail fell left, you stayed and made additional notes. The smoke learned the grammar of the air faster than any instrument we had. It also left stains on your fingers that no water respected. Those stains marked us in markets and on buses and in lines at the baker. No one spoke about them. They are the only uniform I miss. We kept a second measure, too, in case the smoke lied. We laid the red thread across the seam and watched whether it lifted. The red thread had 3 moods: obedience, argument, and prophecy. Obedience meant you could finish by midnight. Argument meant a bell somewhere in the city was sulking and would need to be forgiven. Prophecy meant something had already happened and wanted you to anticipate it retroactively. Prophecy is exhausting. You can feel it in the small bones of the ear. Our steps were not our own. We walked according to the star rule, a lattice of alignments inscribed on a little tin tablet we carried in the inside pocket, beneath the ribs that do not bear weight. The star rule tells you where to place your feet when Mars is sulking and Saturn is pretending virtue. It is less mystical than it sounds. The rule is an ergonomics of fate. You marry your pace to the sky, so the world does not notice that you are moving it in increments. Every seventh night, the archivist revised the tablet with a stylus that cut without removing lines upon lines, instruction folded into instruction, until the tablet looked like a palimpsest of horizon. He did it without looking up. He did it the way a violinist tightens a string between phrases. When we reached the mouth, we did not call it a door to its face. We placed the tools in order on the little shelf carved directly into the breath of the wind. Order mattered less for piety than for physics. A tidy shelf does not lose small things to the dark. The order was always the same: thread, bell, water, smoke, key, pencil. The pencil last because numbers are worst when they feel invited. Then the recitation, no Latin, no theater. Plain words that bind intentions to joints. We are present, we said. We are not inventing. We are caretakers. We propose to persuade the night to resume its good manners. Good manners, Taddeo would say, and press his shoulder to the frame as if reminding the night what a human shoulder weighs. He loved the work more than anyone I have ever seen. Love anything that also harmed them. He was teaching me to love it too. I am still learning how not to. On quiet nights, we traced the invisible lines. You cannot see them, but you can feel them if you breathe like glass. Lines between domes, between crosses, between weathercocks pinning the wind to a roof. Lines between the feet of statues who pretend they have not moved in a century. Lines between the mouths of fountains that exchange gossip across neighborhoods by manipulating humidity. If you map those lines, you discover a geometry that scolds you for thinking in right angles. The city prefers spirals and confessions. The archive taught me to walk both. A cat accompanied us for a season. Black, as clichés arrange such things, but with a white smudge on the chest like a fingerprint left by God in a hurry. She met us at the Miserere and shepherded us with the professional indifference of a librarian closing her stacks. The archivist never acknowledged her. Taddeo fed her bits of salted bread against every rule we were given. When the porta non nata felt warm, the cat's tail would whip once and then settle, as if she had negotiated a stay of execution. When it felt cold, she would sit with a dignity that made the wind apologize for touching her. I asked whose cat she was. No one, Taddeo said. She is ours while we deserve her. The rites were chores, but none of them were arbitrary. If you tracked the small obediences, the angle of the wrist, the placement of the foot, the order of the shelf, you could hear the city's pulse ease. A siren would choose a shorter route. A quarrel below would decide it was tired of itself and turn into tea. A sleepless child would discover he had been breathing all along. This is how we justified ourselves when the work began to scratch. There are harms averted that no ledger can praise because they never happened in the first place. Mercy has a filing problem. On less quiet nights, we performed the sealing. The sealing is one of those acts that crystallizes a career into a gesture. You soften wax with heat borrowed from your own breath. You fold in soot until the wax remembers it was once a color. You press it with the heel of your hand to coax out the stubborn bubbles. Then you lay it into the seam, not like mortar, not like medicine, more like introducing two shy friends. If you do it right, the seam accepts the wax without complaint, the way a sentence accepts an adjective it did not ask for. If you do it wrong, the wax takes offense, hardens with the memory of your hand, and every bird in Rome becomes a critic. Their wings will tell on you for days. I learned to do it right because Taddeo let me do it wrong exactly twice, and the pigeons hounded me into humility. There is a smaller rite that no one writes down: the listening. We would sit with our backs to the mouth and count to 100, slowly, as if 100 were a traveling companion with a limp. During that count, you hear everything the city thinks it isn't saying. Shoes agreeing with cobbles, keys negotiating with pockets, the cough of a saint who refuses to be decorous, the scratch of the archive turning in its sleep. When you stand again, your legs have learned some new truth about gravity. On those nights I felt closest to believing the archivist, that curation was a kindness. It is possible to love lies that behave themselves. That winter, the wind invented a new trick. It learned to braid prayers together. We would hear the word for bread threaded through the word for forgiveness, the word for child braided to the word for city, the word for rain woven into the word for debt. It made me giddy and sad in the same breath. Language is a bell you cannot sleeve. We brought the sleeves anyway. You cannot out-stubborn the wind. You can only suggest. I watched Taddeo age on the roofs faster than he aged on the ground. Rain paints the truth of stone. Wind carves the truth of men. His hair went from iron to pewter in a season. His hands forgot how to tremble. His voice learned to stand at attention without saluting. He told me a story once, when the smoke snake's tail fell left, and we knew the night would not permit us to go home early. Before I took the oaths, he said, I was a carpenter. Doors open, doors close. That was the whole theology. Then I came here and learned that some doors persuade the world to re-remember what being open ever meant. I thought I was becoming a priest of accuracy. I was becoming a midwife for revision, carpentry for ghosts. There is a relief in a good fit. Beware relief. He showed me how to read the slew, the slight creep of the copper plates under temperature's hand. You lie on your side and press your cheek to the metal until you taste green. You watch the horizon without blinking and let your peripheral vision become a magistrate. The slough is the city, settling into its night self. If it slides toward the river, you will spend your hours forgiving bells. If it slides toward the hills, a door somewhere in the neighborhood will be closed against someone it should have let in, and you will make small notes and go apologize quietly in the morning by rearranging a footnote. If it does not slide at all, prepare to be bored and grateful. Boredom is the sweetest mercy of our profession. It means the world is briefly satisfied with itself. Not every rite belonged to us. Some belonged to the sky. On nights when the planets stood at attention like tired soldiers, we performed the star shift. It is the simplest rite. You look up until your neck complains, and you say the names you were taught in the order you were taught them. And then you say the names you were forbidden in no order at all. The forbidden names felt like pebbles in the mouth. They made the saliva ache. The archivist would not say them. Taddeo said them as if he loved them. I said them because I had been told not to, which is a theologian's least noble honesty. The star shift convinced nothing celestial to move. It convinced us to move more carefully beneath it. Sometimes that is all a rite needs to do. Between the miserere and the mouth, there is a hatch that opens to a crawl space lined with lead. We called it the nursery because sound inside it is brand new. You can sing there and hear your voice without its clothes. We went there on nights when rumors grew teeth. Rumors love altitude. They climb spires like ivy. We would read the day's docket of fears, witches, heresies, a prophet selling calendars in the square, and let the nursery strip the rumors down to their ribs. Mostly they were just hunger, wearing superstition as a cloak. Once they were not. Once, a rumor had an extra shadow. We filed that under abducta, because while we could name it, we could not afford to introduce it to the family. Sometime spring lost its patience and suspended itself over the city like a decision. I found myself humming the breath count unconsciously at home. Inhale 7, hold 3, exhale 5, the way we steady the hand that lays the wax. I would wake to find my fingers stained with soot, though I had not worked the night before. The archive had taught my body to be nocturnal in daylight. I stopped correcting it. Correction had become a deity too ready with blessings. One evening, climbing toward the mouth, we found the red thread already laid, taut as a gut string. No one had been scheduled before us. The knotless, memoried fiber trembled as if a sentence had nearly been spoken and then reconsidered politeness. The archivist touched it with one nail. The thread stilled. He did not look at me. "Record this," he said, and I did, with the pencil that refused words. I wrote the number for apprehension. I wrote the number for the metallic taste arriving without metal. I wrote the number for a cat we could not see staring at something that claimed it was not a door. The ledger accepted the integers the way a pond accepts a single harmless stone. We did not open. We performed the listening and left in an order so neat I hated us. That was the first time I felt the rite organizing me more than I organized it. I felt like an obedient bead on an abacus no one had taught me to count. You want the bigger things. The switch from Julian to Gregorian rehearsed on a tabletop in the nursery with wooden tokens that smelled like pears. The lesson on how equinoxes are locks and feast days are teeth. The way a calendar can be taught to purr in your lap if you stroke it in the right direction. That is all true. It is also theater. The bones of the work are smaller, closer to your breath. They live in your hand's politeness. They grow in the habit of not waking a bell that trusts you. They accumulate in the acceptance that a seam should be smooth, not because God prefers smoothness, but because roughness snags memory. On a hot night, lit by the kind of moon that makes sailors uppity and archivists tired, we discovered a fresco that had acquired an extra eyelid. Not the angel, the city. You could feel it blink if you placed your palm just so on the copper and waited with the patience you reserve for forgiving old friends. When it blinked, the air cooled 1 degree, and the candles below agreed to gutter without smoke. We wrote it down as weather. We should not have. Weather takes blame too easily. There were accidents. Taddeo slipped once on dew that had not read the star rule. He did not fall. The city does not permit devotion to be punished for clumsiness when witnesses are scarce. He laughed and pressed his forehead to the copper and thanked the roof for its patience. Later, while sleeving a bell, I pricked my thumb on a burr of iron. I watched a bead of blood swell and hesitated, unsure whether it would count as a tithe. The archivist wrapped my thumb with a strip of linen that smelled like the moon cistern. "Do not bleed on the ledger," he said, which was the kindest thing he could have said. I did not. Twice that spring we found names in the wax where no names should be, faint, as if a thumbprint had tried to learn letters. The first read like a diminutive someone's endearment escaping the rules. The second read like a warning cut short. We smoothed both with the heel of the hand, not out of censorship but out of mercy. If a name appears where a seam belongs, the name will be made to hold weight it cannot bear. It will crack. it will be blamed. I dream about the second name even now. In the dream, the letters look like stitches. In the morning, I cannot remember whether the thread is red. Once, too, we climbed and found pilgrims in the wrong place. 2 boys, beer-stupid with daring, had made the stairs their adventure. They froze when they saw us. Our lanterns like devotions, moving up a wall. I prepared the lecture we keep for such intrusions. Safety, reverence, fines. Taddeo crouched, held out his hand, and showed them the sleeve. He let them touch the velvet. He told them the bell trusted them now. He told them that if they listened carefully in bed that night, they would hear a city fall silent because they had asked it to. He sent them down with a secret that would not injure them to keep. That night, the bell behaved as if it had been dignified by children. I have never forgiven Taddeo for the tenderness of that instruction. If the domes are lungs, the cross at the apex is a compass. By day it is an icon, by night it is a device. We set our knuckles against it to calibrate the metals. Iron, copper, tin, the petty republic of alloys. Metal keeps score better than men. Iron tells you where fear walks. Copper tells you where the city overhears itself. Tin tells you when rumor is wearing a good suit. That night, copper sang like a key turning. The archivist put his lips close to the metal, not kissing, just the intimacy of craftsmen, and listened. He straightened. "A revision is rehearsing," he said. "Not tonight. Soon." Taddeo spat neatly, the way carpenters do before a difficult cut, and tied the red thread around his wrist to remind the thread that loyalty is reciprocal. We did not open the mouth. We made our rounds. We persuaded hinges. We coached bells toward reticence. We argued smoke into eloquence. We taught the air to behave itself. We went home late enough that the first buses were grumbling their way into honesty. I washed my hands and watched the soot refuse to leave the creases. I slept for an hour and dreamed in numbers, and in the dream each number was the age of a woman looking at a fountain and discovering that the water was modest today where it had been shameless yesterday. I woke with the aftertaste of beeswax and the certainty that the city had decided to remember something inconvenient and was looking for a polite way to confess. The next night, the wind came from the sea, though the sea had not promised itself to roam that week. The miserere creaked new grammar. The cat did not come. The archivist's keyring weighed like a sentence. Taddeo's hands did not tremble when they should have. The smoke's tail hesitated, as if remembering a previous life. The red thread lifted with the arrogance of a rumor about to be true. We stood before the mouth. The rites invite repetition. Repetition invites the illusion of mastery. Mastery invites the idea that you can postpone a door by saying its name in the right cadence. We went through the order as if the order could charm a storm. Thread, bell, water, smoke, key, pencil. The pencil last, always last, because numbers are greedy and this night had very little to give. "Listening," the archivist said, and we sat with our backs to the seam and counted to 100 as if the number were an elder whose stories we respected even when they wandered. At 72, I heard iron deliberately forgetting its own forging. At 84, I heard a saint clearing his throat at the wrong time in the Mass. At 91, I heard a calendar page tear and repair itself simultaneously, the way a lie corrects itself to keep the conversation polite. At 100, I heard nothing at all, and the nothing had edges. We stood. The city held its breath. Taddeo reached for the hinge with the backs of his fingers, and even from where I stood, I could feel the warmth that was not mechanical. "We should not," I said. "We never should," he said, and smiled like a man telling a child that, of course, monsters do not exist in a room where you keep the lights right. The archivist lifted the bell clapper, the velvet still on, the red thread dangling like an uncommitted question. He glanced at the cross. He glanced at the city. He looked up, always up last, and weighed the sky the way a priest weighs his words. He did not ring, not yet. He tucked the clapper into his palm as if closing a book that refused to end. "We will open," he said, and my stomach turned like a page. But that belongs to another night. Before any opening, the rite requires a record. You think this is bureaucracy. It is anesthesia. We wrote the weather as a fraction. We wrote the moon as a verb. We wrote the weight of our own hearts as an approximation, because that is the only honest way to weigh a heart. The pencil obeyed, as numbers always obey when invited to pretend they are not involved. Taddeo signed his name, and the graphite darkened as if relieved to belong to someone who could carry the consequences with a carpenter's back. We replaced the pencil in its place, and the ledger in its satchel, and the satchel under the shelf, and the shelf under the wind under the sky, and the sky under our breath. We did not open. We walked the rest of the night, like men measuring a room for a coffin they hope to outgrow. We coaxed a sulking bell. We taught a hinge the humor of compliance. We hummed the star shift because the forbidden names tasted, for once, like mercy. And all the while, the mouth warmed like bread. By dawn, the heat had relaxed into a promise. The city lifted its head and pretended not to glance at us. "They zes. No vries. What Dave?" I went down into the waking city and bought bread from a woman who had changed her hair since yesterday. She seemed surprised to feel the braid at her neck. She smiled at me as if I could confirm she had always been this way. I could not. I wanted to. I went home and slept with my notebook open on my chest so the numbers could crawl out if they wished. This is what the roofs and the rites gave me. A way of being in the world that feels like planting pins into a map that keeps correcting its coastlines. It is a confidence that your hand knows where the hinge will be when the dark says it has eaten it. It is a tenderness toward bells I cannot justify to anyone who has never asked a voice to keep a secret. It is a distrust of tidy weather. It is the knowledge that the city has lungs and an eyelid and a throat that sometimes declines to swallow. Above all, it is this, the sensation, irreversible once learned, that silence is not absence, but architecture, and that somewhere, at the edge of the architecture, a door that was never meant to be born waits for a night that will insist on it. They told us to listen before we read. Paper has a throat, leather has lungs. Iron remembers the hands that cooled it. If a room is truly silent, it is either lying or asleep. The chained library does not sleep. It paces in place, links whispering, wood settling, a page hesitating mid-breath, as if deciding whether to keep a word for itself. The door into that room requires no key. The keys are inside, attached to spines and expectations. The lock is the etiquette of scholars, and the first rule of etiquette is pretending everyone agrees. The light in the library is older than the lamps. We trimmed the wicks to a parishioner's patience, never so bright that ink becomes boastful, never so dim that vowels begin to guess. The chains are not punitive. Punishment is public theater. These links are domestic, intimate, a promise that no one will run away, simply because the night becomes inconvenient. Each is braided from 3 metals, one of which refuses to be named in daylight. They warm to the touch if you are calm. They resist you if you are greedy. I learned the trick of resting my palm on a link until it accepted my particular heat, the way a cat adopts a lap without conceding duty. The first book I unlocked sighed. The second rasped its leaves like a miller checking grain. The third lay quiet under my hand, and the quiet had weight. We shelved the quiet ones close to the floor, not from disrespect but from gravity. Heavy stillness belongs low, where the building can carry it without learning to limp. The noisy volumes lived higher, so their arguments could tire themselves out against the rafters. High-shelved books grow arrogant if indulged. We dusted them first, not as punishment, but as reminder. Titles are weather. They change with the season and with who speaks them. Many spines wore their Latin in iron leaf that had eaten into the leather like a tidy parasite. Others had no title at all, and the absence read like a courtesy extended to a dangerous guest. There are the Gospels, you know, the ones that kiss your vow and go back to their proper shelves. And then there are the ones the room refuses to name. The archivist called them interlinear witnesses and smiled as if the phrase meant mercy. Taddeo called them the whisperers. I called them my inventory of disobedience. One of the whisperers has margins pricked with needles, tiny perforations like star maps that forgot why they were drawn. Hold it to the lamp, and the light chooses its own constellations, guiding your eye to a path you did not mean to take. The ink behaves badly in the best sense. It hums under certain vowels, stains the air with a smell like rain arriving where no clouds have yet been persuaded. When I read it, the consonants slid into the voice that taught me to pray the small, work-roughened certainty of my mother. She has been dead a long time, but grief is a bell you cannot sleeve. I kept reading because it felt like forgiveness, and then I understood that the text had transubstantiated my loyalty into an instrument. "Close it," the archivist said gently, as you tell a man to close his eyes at the scene of an accident. Not every intimacy is a sacrament. Rose Payne. On a high shelf, we kept the map books, bound in oxblood and corrected in a hand that apologized for its own precision. Open them, and you do not find roads. You find alignments, pilgrim paths braided across zodiac wheels, shrines placed where a star would appear if the sky were obedient to stone. Ports and passes kneel to constellations, the way courtiers kneel to etiquette. It is easy to call this superstition until you place your fingers on the paper and feel the faint burr where a ridge in the earth agreed with a line of verse. Some maps were sewn into other books, thread so fine you only noticed when it refused to break. We filed those under obducta, obscured, because someone had decided that a library is a city where certain streets never quite lead where they appear to go. I learned the catalog of absences. It is a taxonomy of ghosts with good posture. We kept cards for things that were not there. Niches with no saints whose dust remembered knees. Chapels where the paint held the shape of a halo with no head permitted. Feast days that sighed when you tapped their dates, like a tooth ashamed of a cavity. The trick is to write an index that honors a missing object without making the gap glamorous. Absence attracts fetishists. We served accountants. There was a ledger of popes swaddled in buckram that smelled like old apples. Between centuries, 3 pages had been sewn in with silk so pale it bet against light. They listed men elected in a season unkept by calendars, each name paired with an instrument: compass, razor, comb. The archivist afforded himself the smallest pleasure of teaching. The compass is for drawing circles that look like perfection and are actually fences. The razor is for trimming spring into late winter. The comb is for grooming memory until it stops snarling. He showed me the stitch, how to pass the needle through parchment without tearing history, how to pull the silk until the page consented to believe it had always been dented. Why not burn these? I asked, because I was still naive enough to think fire is final. Because ash is harder to catalog, he said. Because flame is a child and insists on telling stories to the neighbors. We kept a separate catalog for rumors. Most die harmlessly when written down. Ink makes braggarts honest. Some learn to breathe in the dark. A rumor about saints erased from the roll would come to the shelf limping, swaddled in the affection of grandmothers and the malice of bored men. We would check it against ledgers, against the dust's account, against the way a stair had learned to dip for a particular procession. Sometimes the rumor wore enough truth to earn a cot. Sometimes it dissolved on the tongue like sacramental wafer. Once in winter, a rumor arrived cold to the touch, like a coin just dug from soil. We placed it near the floor and told it we were not its enemies. It softened into a fact, small enough to survive the week. There is a cupboard labeled with days that no longer exist. Sundays, with an extra silence between psalms. Thursdays that used to be called something else. We kept candles there, stubs that held the memory of hands that prayed awkwardly, honestly. On nights when the porta non nata shivered, we would bring one of those stubs to the roof and let it teach the air how to behave properly. You think I am being poetic. I am being specific. The air mimics its elders. Give it a candle with dignified habits, and it will learn to draw breath like a choir. On the second shelf of the fourth bay sits an innocuous breviary, bound in mouse-soft leather, that was never alive. I opened it for the comfort of untroubled psalms, and found, between the collects, a set of timetables, tiny grids, like woven baskets, showing how the moon is a bureaucracy if you ask politely. Each table paired a phase of light with a human frailty, and beside each pairing a note: ring once, ring twice, do not ring. An instruction book for mercy disguised as devotion. We copied it out for the younger guards and told them it was tradition. They obeyed better when told the past had already consented. Certain books breathe. This is not metaphor. The vellum of their pages drinks from the air and returns it through pores, too fine to see, altering the room's humidity enough that the chains relax a fraction. We learned their rhythms the way you learn a friend's insomnia. On wet nights, they lay quiet and fed themselves without help. On dry nights, we cracked the window and let Rome share a lung with us. Taddeo would hum, tuneless and kind, and the books would settle. The archivist pretended not to notice his superstition. The archive is full of educated men who secretly adore lullabies. There is a gospel that speaks everyone's childhood language except their own. It will not translate itself into the idiom you used before you learned to be careful. I watched a scholar read and weep in German for a mother he had resented in Italian. I watched a sister read and shake in Portuguese for a father she knew only through French reprimands. I read and the script took my mother's voice and rearranged it into a woman who forgave me for leaving. I set the book down and hated it for its accuracy. It had not lied. It had polished. Polishing is what we called kindness when we were tired of the truth. In the corner near the window stood a globe that refused geography. Where you expected continents, you found eras, polished latitudes named for habits. The age of useful courage, the season of pious accounts, the afternoon of narrow bells. You could spin it and feel under your palm the resistance of a century that did not wish to be revisited. The archivist would use it to explain revisions to the young. Here is where the calendar apologized for its arithmetic. Here is where martyrs were weighed against meteors and found compatible. Here is where an artist's hand trembled, and the city decided to call it angelic intervention rather than the honest shiver of hunger. In a flat file, we kept maps of catacombs overdrawn with constellations. Threaded lines linked bones to stars, as if the dead had been organized into patterns so the living above would keep proper time. Some passages on those maps were shaded with a pigment that does not show on holy days. We did not test that claim irreverently. We waited an ordinary Tuesday and proved to ourselves that irreverence is not the only way to learn. A note in the margin, crabbed and tidy. When bells are sleeved and the moon is fat, memory takes the longer hallway. I copied it into my notebook without permission. Later, I found the sentence had rearranged itself. When memory is sleeved and the hallway is fat, the moon takes the longer bells. Corrections, masquerading as humor. The archive does not like to be caught with its pins showing. There was a shelf called the Concordance of Errors, a choir book of contradictions, each voice entering a beat too late and resolving beautifully if you listened from the doorway. It contained a record of wrong dates, a ledger of miscopied names, a reconciliation of misaligned eclipses with misdirected processions. I loved it the way some men love their first knife. It taught me how catastrophe wears a collar and answers to Alexander when called in the right tone. The concordance convinced me that revision is not villainy but stewardship. This belief almost saved me, almost ruined me. In a drawer with a shallow brass pull lived a comb carved from the rib of a beast that never consented to live. We used it to groom vellum, lifting dust, housing static, convincing fibers to lie down like hair parted for a photograph. Once I drew the comb through a folio, and a strand caught so fine I could not see it singing a note just at the edge of forgiveness. The page released it with a tiny shock. I looked at my finger and saw a welt, spelling the first letter of a saint's name that no longer had a shrine. "File that," the archivist said. I asked under what heading. "Courtesy," he said. "We acknowledge the greeting and decline the conversation." Is have. Mother, you want the moment I began to mistrust the room. It was not a thunderclap. It was a correction, so well executed it left no mess and therefore no mercy. I returned for the whispering gospel that made my mother speak kindly and found only a gap tidy as a tooth extracted by a competent dentist. The chain hung with propriety. The label read Vacat, and the dust had been combed to a neutrality impressive even for professionals. A small card affixed to the shelf said, "Requited to the care of another room." This is a phrase the archive uses when it does not wish to discuss where a thing has gone. I stood with my hand on the chain, feeling the warmth of a conversation recently concluded in a language I do not speak, and understood that the library does not merely store obedience, it trains it. I refused to be theatrical. I opened another book at random to cleanse my palate. It was a book of bells' names, weights, temperaments, the human dispositions each bell could coax from a crowd. One bell pacified envy, another discouraged heroic lies, a third was best rung when the city needed sleep more than it needed courage. Each entry ended with a notation: sleeve, unsleeve, petition. Petition meant ask nicely and mean it. Below the table, a hand had written in a more impatient ink, "Do not let pity learn arithmetic." I closed the book and became careful with my kindness. The archivist had detectors subtler than mine. He would pass his hand a hair's breadth above a row of spines and feel for drafts the tiny exhale of a book negotiating with its memory. If he paused, we paused. If he smiled, we permitted ourselves optimism. If he frowned, we learned to make the rest of our faces still. "There," he would say, though there was no there yet. And then some interlinear witness would exhale in resignation, and we would rearrange our plans for the night. There is a ceremony the archive pretends is maintenance: the aligning of tables, calendars, feast lists, lunar charts, rosters of emperors and their preferred saints, all laid out on the long oak like a surgeon's tools. We walked around them clockwise while the archivist read the years aloud in an order compatible with weather. When he reached a number that offended him, he did not scold, he polished. He would move a saint's day 3 mornings to the left, teaching devotion to arrive punctual to an eclipse. He would reduce a famine to a poor harvest and redistribute the suffering into footnotes. He would add a pope where a pope had always been, if you asked the room kindly. I once watched him erase a massacre by refurbishing a bridge and explaining the expense, mercy by accounting. He called it harmonization. Taddeo called it housekeeping. My stomach called it fasting and carried on. We kept a ladder that disliked men who lied to themselves. It wobbled under pretense and steadied under confession. The first time I climbed it with certainty, I was a good man guarding better men's secrets. It bucked like a mule and introduced me to the floor. I told the ladder I was obedient and afraid. It let me up. This is how the room tutors, by aligning small humiliations with honest balance. It is a pedagogy of stable furniture. God should consider it. Some nights we hosted visitors, scholars with permissions like medals, eyes frantic with love for their small corner of the world. We shepherded them between bays, offered gloves they wore like pennants, and watched their breathing slow when they realized the books did not wish to be flattered. One Dominican traced a line of text with a finger that had baptized thousands, and asked me if stories were safer than facts. "Facts bruise," he said. "Stories scar. Scars are tidy." I told him scars itch in the heat. He laughed and left with a papered permission to quote nobody. I began to keep my own index, a private card catalog of hesitations. Not titles, not authors, not dates, only the little stalls where a sentence paused before choosing its next verb, the faint erasures where a scribe had regretted an adjective and pretended he had not, the places where the chain felt warmer than the book required. A library is not only a treasury, it is a vital sign. You can diagnose a century by its cough. You can tell when a city has chosen endurance over clarity by how its margins accommodate sorrow. My cards became a pulse chart. The pulse grew irregular when the porta non nata warmed. In a flat drawer stamped with a symbol we were not supposed to recognize, 2 lines crossing like men avoiding eye contact, lay a planetarium made of bone. We are back to the orrery, but this one lived here, smaller, private, intimate as a rosary. A dozen spheres like polished teeth, a ring like a wedding that outlived its vows, wires soldered with the patience of a saint who has forgiven everyone except himself. When you turned it, the shelves grumbled very softly, acknowledging an authority they did not love. Once I touched it, without asking. The globes shivered. A folio 3 bays over shut itself politely. "Do not move the sky indoors without warning the paper," the archivist said, and I apologized to a book as to a friend I had startled in her kitchen. You want the whispers. You want to know if they are literal, if consonants ride the air and vowels tint the light, and if, standing alone among the chains, a man can hear words that never learn to walk in daylight? Yes, but not like stories promise. The whisper is not a voice. It is a choice, manifesting as sound. Pages decide together to stop tolerating a lie, and the decision makes a noise like hair braided gently. Indexes agree to forgive a misspelling, and the forgiveness creaks like new wood. 3 Gospels consent to share a wound, and the consent leaves a taste like copper. You can call it haunting if it pleases you. I call it work behaving honestly. It was in such a chorus hair, wood, copper, that I found a map inside a gospel, not slipped between leaves, but in the vellum itself, press-printed long ago. A catacomb plan cross-cut by a zodiac, nodes marked not with altars but with edicts. The moon's house aligned with a vault of bones, labeled only with the letter that stood for a season no one now keeps. A note, crabbed and affectionate. When Saturn feigns humility, move the confession 3 doors down. I tracked the tunnels with my finger until I felt a slight rise, a hidden stitch crossing a passage like a raised vein. Someone had sewn the text to the path so no one could remove it without teaching the room to bleed. I took the book to the archivist, proud as a child who has found his first true fossil. He looked, smiled without teeth, and asked if I felt brave enough to become necessary. "What does that mean?" I said. He set the gospel down as if laying a feverish infant back into its crib. "It means," he said, "you will open the door when it warms." He dusted the chain, as if polishing the collar of a dog he loved for its obedience and not for its heart. That night, my mother's voice was not there. I went to the shelf in defiance of good sense and found the tidy gap again, the chain lightly swinging as if edifying a draught. I knelt. Not in piety, piety and I were on difficult terms, but to read the bottom board where old librarians leave insults. There in the carpentry were knife scratches from a hand that hated neatness, a name I recognized as a saint who had never been, a date 3 centuries shy of decency, a little drawing of a bell with a sleeve sewn too tight. Someone had resisted competence here. Someone had lost. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard counting. Not numbers. The shape of counting, the feel of adding a breath to a breath. The way minutes agree to pile up when asked sternly. Counting forward is management. Counting backward is confession. The room was confessing. I stood and placed my hand on a row of spines, as a man places his hand on the foreheads of children at bedtime. "I hear you," I said, and immediately felt ridiculous, and immediately did not care. Books do not require our dignity to function. They require our honesty. Taddeo found me there and offered a fig. He was a man who solved tenderness with food. "The archivist says you made a discovery," he said. I told him about the map in the Gospel. He nodded, not impressed, not dismissive, like a carpenter inspecting a joint he expects to hold. Good, he said. Now you will learn how to carry what you know without dropping it on people's feet. I asked him if he had ever wanted to burn the room. He laughed, the laugh of a man who has imagined worse and chosen better. Sometimes, he said, I want to open all the windows and let Rome teach the books manners. But then a child somewhere falls asleep because we asked a bell not to brag, and I become reasonable again. Reasonableness is a narcotic in buildings like this. It tastes like competence and leaves you with clean hands. I wanted stained hands. I wanted to come home marked with what I loved, the way bakers bring flour to bed and painters wake with pollen under their nails. The library stains are discreet. They hide where your lovers will not notice. There is a register for miracles that have consented to be categorized. Each entry wears 2 dates: when the wonder occurred and when it agreed to become evidence. Sometimes the second date is centuries later. Sometimes the ink never dries. We used that register to balance our nights. If we took a year from a calendar to smooth an empire, we tried to give 30 good minutes to a street where grief had taken a room. You will say this is arrogance. You are right, but the alternative is neglect disguised as humility. I prefer arrogance that knows it is borrowing. In a glass-topped case, we kept seals' wax impressed with rings that never adorned a living hand. Their faces are stern, keys crossed with stars, lambs looking over their shoulders as if suspicious of their shepherds, a ship with all its sails taken down as if waiting for the sea to remember it. We heated the seals with breath and pressed them to slips, allowing access. This saint may be spoken of again. This pope's name may be permitted in rumors. This date may forgive its arithmetic. The seals left scars on paper, like dignified bruises. I learned to love the bruises. They were proof of negotiation, not conquest. The library keeps a wall where we pinned notices of returns, not the books that came back from loan, but the memories a city hesitantly accepted again. A niche relit, a hymn remembered by the wrong parish and admired into propriety. A widow who found her husband's name in a list and discovered she could grieve in daylight. We pinned those slips with brass tacks that tarnished quickly, as if embarrassed by joy. I would stand there and let myself be convinced that curation is a form of love that leaves room for breath. It was a summer afternoon, smuggled into night heat, clinging to stone like a promise kept too long when the whispering sharpened, not louder, finer, like a blade honed past practicality into the realm of pride. The chains ticked as if cooled in a sudden shadow. The lamps, without wind, fluttered in agreement. The archivist walked in already frowning. "Take the bone orrery," he said to me, "and turn it once. Slowly. Teach the shelves what the sky intends." I turned. The tooth spheres rolled. The wires hummed. A book spat itself shut 2 bays over. Another opened as if correcting a misapprehension. The room arranged its face. The archivist watched me with the calculation of a physician deciding whether to let a fever do the clean work before intervening. "Again," he said, softer, as if we were training a foal. When the hum settled, he nodded toward the concordance of errors. "Find the entry for the night the smoke curled wrong," he said. I knew the place, a paragraph pretending to be a calendar, pretending to be a prayer. There, in someone's hand that had loved neatness more than sleep, a line had been added. Door warmed, deferred, and below it, already corrected so cleanly the correction would be invisible to a civilian eye. Door warmed, prepared. One verb shifted, a whole city moved. I think that is when the library ceased to be a room and became a person to me. An old aunt with strong wrists and an inconvenient memory, who loves you enough to claim your lies before you can be caught with them in your mouth. I stood with my hand on the page, feeling the ink still sweat from its exertion, and for the first time asked whether our mercy was only management investments. The archivist, reading my face like a novice's catechism, said, "Do not become cruel to avoid sentimentality. That is a cheap heresy." "I am not becoming cruel," I said. "You are becoming precise," he said. "Precision frightens men who have lived well on metaphors. Keep one metaphor in your pocket to comfort them. Keep the rest of your pockets empty." I tucked silence into my pocket and found it obedient. The room breathed. A chain clicked like a bead on a rosary clicking through arthritic fingers. Outside, the city coughed a bus into motion. The fig Taddeo had given me left a sweetness on my tongue that felt borrowed from a kinder country. And I understood that whatever came next would ask me to spend that sweetness without a receipt. We left the library near dawn, the lamps raw and regretful, the chains relieved of our heat. On the threshold, a draft stroked my wrist where the red thread had once slept. It felt like a pulse. It felt like a door practicing a smile. I told myself I was being fanciful, that wood moves and stone cools and air finds paths because architecture allows it. Then, the smallest book in the room, a child's primer of saints with simple faces and cheerful punishments, fell from its shelf and landed spine down, open to a page where a name had been erased, so carefully the paper had learned to be blank without resentment. We did not pick it up. The archivist looked at me as a man looks at a bridge he has crossed hundreds of times and suddenly cannot trust. "Tonight," he said, "we will climb early." Taddeo kissed 2 fingers and pressed them to the doorframe, half carpenter, half penitent. "Bring the sleeve that won't knot," he told me. "Bring the wax that remembers smoke. Bring the pencil last." "And the gospel?" I said, meaning the one that stole my mother's voice. "The gospel," the archivist said, "has gone to teach another room how to behave. We will not expect it at dinner." We ascended into a night that had learned a new temperature. The porta-nonnata was warm in the way bread is warm when a hungry house is trying to be decent. The red thread lifted with the arrogance of good silk. The bells, sleeved, agreed to keep their opinions. The city curled itself like a cat into the corner of its own couch. The sky rehearsed failure and decided to postpone it until we had finished our round. On the Miserere we paused, as always, to count and to pretend counting was control. Below us, a fountain argued with itself, and then chose to be beautiful. The cross at the apex whispered iron to copper, copper to tin, tin to rumor, rumor to prayer. The ladders conceded we were honest enough for the height. My hands were clean. The library stains had retreated to the creases where lovers forgive them. "Listen," Taddeo said, and we stood as men stand when remembering a tune they were taught before words. I heard the library speaking without paper, the comb promising discipline, the globe bargaining with years, the whispering gospel giving my mother's voice to someone else with more need than I had earned. I heard the chains practicing for the moment they would have to rattle alarm without alarming anyone. I heard the concordance hum a chord that resolves only if you consent to humility. I heard the pencil practicing the numbers for apology, and underlying it, the smallest sound, like silk learning to love a knot. We finished the rites with the fussy tenderness of men dressing a child for an afternoon in church. We placed the tools in their order on the shelf, cut into the breath of wind, thread, bell, water, smoke, key, pencil. We sat with our backs to the seam and counted a slow 100, as if teaching an old horse to trust the bridge. At 99, the air thickened. At 100, it would have been a kindness to pretend we did not feel what we felt. We stood. "It will open," the archivist said, as if announcing weather. "Soon," Taddeo said, as if measuring wood. "Yes," I said, as if confessing to someone I loved that I had misplaced the name she gave me. The library laid a hand on my shoulder from very far away. I could feel the weight of every chain and every whisper and every erased name that still believed in its own pronunciation. I understood that books are not safe houses, they are agreements. We had been signing for rooms we did not own. It is a modern comfort to think knowledge protects. In the chained library, knowledge is an instrument, protection, a rhythm, mercy, a margin, and truth, if it comes like a cat, only to those who have learned to deserve indifference. We prepared to open the door. We were taught the sky was a ledger and the calendar a lock. You do not open one without the other agreeing to be useful. Most people inherit dates like furniture, solid, a little ugly, too heavy to move. We learned to hear the furniture creak until it confessed which legs were shorter. The trick was never violence, it was alignment. Give a hinge the pin it wants, and the door forgives you for how often you enter. The lesson began where all respectable blasphemies begin, with arithmetic. The archivist rolled a strip of parchment across the table in the nursery, our crawl space where sound is born naked, and drew a thin line from left to right. "This is how the street imagines time," he said. "Forward, obedient, vain." He dipped the nib again and, beneath the first, drew a circle that never closed, its ends almost shy of each other. "This is how the sky insists." Between them he sketched a comb of tiny ticks, solstices, equinoxes, saint days, coronations, teeth, looking for a jaw. Locks require both. A calendar is a key only when it consents to be a blade. He did not say Julian or Gregorian, not at first. He drew instead the old Roman stubbornness months, named for men who owed everything to weather and the patient precession of the equinox, the great slow drift, like furniture dragged across a ceiling above us. "When the drift grows loud," he said, "cities trip over thresholds. We tidy the step." We rehearsed with tokens, thin wooden circles that used to be pairs. The archivist inked them with innocuous words: harvest, Lent, tax, tide, feast, war, wedding, debt. He arranged them on the table into a year that looked quaint and haphazard, and then he brought the bone orrery from the library, the small one, teeth white and intimate, and set it at the table's end. "Turn," he told me. I did. The tiny spheres rolled, the wires sang like a seamstress working after midnight, the tokens quivered. Harvest sidled toward tax, as if ashamed. Feast confessed its dependence on debt. War pretended not to notice wedding. We watched the harmonies misalign, and then, with velvet on the clapper and salt on the tongue, we taught the tokens to click. "Now call it reform," the archivist said, almost tender. "Call it mercy. Change the words. Do not change the sound. Only when my fingers had learned to crave the click did he say the names. Julian as a boast, Gregorian as an apology. The first a generous mistake gifted by empire, the second a correction disguised as humility. A correction, he said, is a key filed in public. The filing is for the crowd, the teeth are for the lock. We marked the missing 10 days the church bulletin story civilians tell, cheerful and insufficient, and then we laid the orrery over the paper. The little planets do not care for your convenience. They teach it. The equinox precesses with the boredom of a saint, and men with mitres have never enjoyed boredom. So we shortened the year a breath, the archivist said, eyes on the spheres. We tugged the month's hem. We apologized to spring. We paid winter in respectable coin. He tapped the place on the line where centuries learned to trip. And beneath that apology, we filed a new tooth. These go that. What tooth? I asked, willing myself to be dim so he would keep teaching. The kind that does not open a door, he said, but closes a corridor where an emperor might have been, or a plague, or a baker who saw too much. A corridor that allowed a poet to meet a mathematician in the wrong decade and breed an argument the city could not afford. Locks do not only protect rooms, they also tidy hallways. He drew little squares on the paper and wrote pleasant, bureaucratic words in them. Synod, council, reckoning, reform. Under each square he drew a second, smaller square with no label at all, only a number shaped like a breath held too long. These are the private dates, he said, the ones we use to talk to the sky without alarming the street. Taddeo, who lacked patience for pedantry and reverenced it anyway, took the pencil that wrote only numbers and annotated the air with integers. He numbered the rings of the orrery as if soothing children after a quarrel. If you teach them to take turns, he said, they do not bruise each other as much. He pointed. Here is the leap, you know, the 4-year forgiveness. Here is the leap we do not publish. The 7 and 2 our hinges prefer when the copper contracts with grief. Here is the quiet year that sits down behind a summer and looks like shade. DDAs. Phantom time, I said, tasting the phrase as a civilian would taste a rumor. The years that aren't. Phantom is for ghosts, the archivist said. We work with furniture. Time is a room that has learned hospitality. Sometimes hospitality requires telling a guest his train has already left. He showed me the teeth, not on paper. Paper flatters itself and lies politely. He took me up to the bell room and made me listen to the afternoon without bells. When a city agrees to keep its hour as a quiet secret, you can hear windows blinking and shutters confessing small crimes. There, he said, when my ear was raw, that is a missing day left to harden on the sill. He put my hand on the iron and I felt a tiny notch that had not been there the week before. We file it under harmonization, he said. We use it when a bridge needs an alibi. Why not tell people? I asked, not yet tired of naivete. Why not teach them how to polish their own thresholds? Because, he said, the human heart is a calendar that refuses to believe it has been shorted. People count grief in nights. They do not forgive arithmetic. The star rule returned our tin tablet of alignments, now overlaid with numbers that dressed as months. On nights when Mars sulked and Saturn pretended virtue, we walked the domes in steps that matched a century's revision. It is hard to explain without sounding religious. The body is an abacus if trained gently. Knees become hinges that negotiate with years. Ankles learn the etiquette of constellations. The spine is a plumb line persuaded to kindness. We were not moving stones so much as asking names to sit in the places where the world would forget to look for them. Names, I asked. Of eras, he said. An era is a very shy animal. It will come to the hand if you pretend not to want it. He introduced us to the celestial lock, the way a father introduces his children to the sea, with pride, with caution, with the private sorrow that they will love it more than him. It lives in a vault deep enough that the air respects itself. Not an instrument, no brass flourish, no priestly garnish, just a ring of hammered iron, older than its own shadow, set into a plate of stone that knows more winters than the city above. Around the ring, 12 little bell-less mouths, each with a tooth inside, each tooth etched in a script of angles the sky favors when it is pretending not to speak. These are the houses, he said. Not astrology, he added, as if the word had asked to be included. Alignment. We do not beg the stars, we bind our politeness to their patience. I put my fingers on the ring and felt nothing. Then I felt the city leaning its shoulder into my palm as a dog leans into a trusted knee. The archivist turned the ring a breath. The mouths clicked, tiny jawbones approving of supper. Above us, a bell we were not near decided to be content with its own weight. You hear it, he said, not quite asking. I hear approval, I said. You hear consent, he said. Consent buys us a corridor. We use that corridor not to smuggle kings or treasure. Those are operatic reasons, suitable for plays, but to ferry edits. A Nike, redirected into an angel. A river's flood explained as piety. A mathematician's inconvenient note delayed into obscurity until the city had taught itself to use it as decoration. There are violences we refuse, the archivist said. We will not erase a child. We will not shorten a plague if it would cost the lesson. We will not invent a victory for a man who cannot carry it. But a date, he pinched the air, turning a wick in memory. A date can survive surgery. The first operation I witnessed began with bread. A baker had written his accounts in a hand so honest it made auditors itch. His flour deliveries had overlapped with a famine that the city preferred to remember as weather and prayer. The ledger suggested a market, the market suggested hoarding, the rumor suggested sin. We carried the ledger to the vault. Taddeo set the bone orrery to the month when Mars forgot to be brave. The archivist turned the iron ring 1 degree and asked the third house to forgive. A tooth answered with a click. We returned the ledger to its shelf. The famine moved 3 streets to the left and lost its accusation. The baker's grandson married into a family that slept with windows open. I am aware of how tidy that sounds. It was not tidy to live through. Mercy never is. You will want emperors. You will want forged reigns, weeks minted like counterfeit coins, masked popes in alleyways passing centuries hand to hand. All that exists in books you would not enjoy reading. The truth is more domestic. Midnights misplaced, birthdays that never quite land, funerals held on afternoons that hospitals cannot explain. We learn to move the tide under the boats without capsizing grief. We learned that if you nudge a saint's feast 2 mornings to the left, a bridge will stand through a storm it would otherwise have taken personally. We learned that the human body forgives dates, provided we do not insult anniversaries. An anniversary is a bite trained to accept the hand. The Ledger of Leaps became my private catechism. It contained the public rule every 4th year you pretend the earth owes you time, alongside the private ones. The quiet quarter that some centuries pay in penance. The Mercy Week, inserted like a folded handkerchief into wars that forget to end. The Ash Tuesday, that wasn't when a pope's cough made a city discover the virtue of vacuum. Each entry carried a counterweight wakefulness somewhere else. Time is parsimonious. If you sleep through a Tuesday by consensus, someone will be asked to remember a Sunday twice. I began to keep score with a pettiness I despised. When we gained an hour to save a square from breaking, where did the hour bruise? When we rescued a date from scandal, which ordinary Thursday paid the humiliation of becoming a number with less dignity. The archivist accused me gently, as always, of bookkeeping when the problem required husbandry. "We are not accountants," he said. "We are gardeners. If you follow the water with a ruler, you will starve the trees. Learn the thirst of the ground by smell." I smelled iron overheating and tin becoming sarcastic beneath my hands. I smelled copper remembering a kiss. The cross at the apex, our nightly compass, complained when we leaned too hard on its elementals. "The metals keep score," Taddeo said, his carpenter's smile apologizing to the nails that had rescued his life. He taught me to lay my knuckles against the vertical, to listen for resentment. Metals resent quietly. They learn grudge like moss learns stone. The cat despised the vault. She followed us to the threshold and sat, eyes half closed, tail decisionless. I told myself she was allergic to dust. Taddeo, who believed animals read theology better than we do, touched her head with 2 fingers and called her Signora Calendaria, a joke that became too accurate. On nights when the celestial lock refused our politeness, she would yawn as if to say, "The sky is busy. Come back when you are dignified." When the lock approved, she would ignore us, which is the only blessing cats have authority to offer. There were failures. Do not trust any memoir that refuses them. We tried to stitch a pope's death to a comet because poets had already done it in the street, and we liked the story too much to contradict it. The houses refused consent. We pushed anyway, and a year later a museum acquired a painting whose angel's wrist bent in a way wrists do not. The angel became famous. 1,000 necks learned to ache from imitation. We filed the ache under aesthetic minor harm, and baked bread for the poor for 7 Tuesdays in penance. The city prefers bread to apologies. The word phantom returned in my head like a rash that will not learn humility. At night, the domes hummed with absences. We could not catalog rooms that did not remember their own chairs, professorships that, when you traced them back far enough, closed their eyes and refused to choose a founder. I asked the archivist if we were making ghosts by sweeping too well. "No," he said, "we are teaching dust to lie down. Ghosts are born when dust decides it is a cloud." He took me to a wall where the library pinned notices of returns, memories accepted again. Below it, smaller slips recorded memories we had asked the city to set aside for a season. The seasons sometimes lasted longer than men. A widow's petition to restore her husband's name to a casualty roll, denied politely because the roll had learned to be proud of its symmetry. A parish's request to keep a feast day on the date that felt right under their tongues, declined because the eclipse would not tolerate their convenience. "We are not monsters," we told ourselves. "We are stewards." Stewardship sounds generous when you are not the one being tidied. If the lock is the mechanism, the liturgy of its use is pedestrian. Wash hands in moon water. Grease the knuckles with the tiniest wipe of lamp oil. Speak the integers without owning them. Turn the iron one breath and never two. You do not force the click. You invite it. The sound is small. The way forgiveness is small. A bead on a string. A consonant consenting to behave. Above ground, the bells answered with silence. I will tell you, because you have earned it by your patience, about the night we bought an hour. A flood grew clever, preferring the lower streets, choosing them repeatedly until the cobbles learned the word for humiliation. We brought the council their numbers tidy with zeros and old river names, and they tried to move blame upstream. Blame flows downhill, like water and gossip. We went to the vault. The archivist turned the ring to the house that makes merchants pious. The tooth hesitated. Taddeo laid the red thread over the iron the way you lay a ribbon across a child's brow to teach it where to be cool. The tooth clicked. We carried the hour to a dawn that had not yet decided to exist. The flood arrived tangential to itself, confused, and took the long way round. 2 shops opened the next week on streets that had forgotten to be ashamed. A fisherman died anyway, 6 months later, in a town up coast that never once thought of Rome. This is how mercy behaves when the city is large enough to misplace its conscience. I began to dream in calendars the good, unlikely kind where you recall dates like spices and arrange them by scent. In the dream, the months are animals at a watering place. January pushes because it thinks it deserves respect. March smiles with a soldier's teeth. June sits as if to be painted. September counts. I would wake and smell beeswax and tin and numbers and think, for a gentle second, that I had wed the sky, and we were learning to live without envy. Then I would remember the baker and his ledger, and the grandson's open windows and the fisherman, and I would sit with the discomfort as you sit with a friend who needs you to let his version be the room for a while. When the lock did not like us, it taught static to the air, not audible, not visible, just hairs on the wrist, learning attention the way a choir learns a breath. When it liked us, it shared its age. You could feel winters through stone like rings through a stump. Taddeo, counting under his breath like a carpenter ordering pegs, would smile and forgive the iron its mood. Everything made, he would say, has a temperament. Time is made. Treat it as you would a violin. The archivist forbade us the story of an emperor invented to justify a staircase, good fun, barroom history, beloved by men who collect the past the way boys collect knives. We do not condescend to the century, he said. We waste no one's grandfather to sharpen a joke. He allowed us the micro-shifts, a bullseye moved on a fresco to teach an arrow to land later, a baptismal font relocated to accommodate a season of illness, a relic procession taught to walk around a corner that would otherwise have learned cruelty. These are housekeeping, Taddeo would say, proud to be a servant when service had teeth. You may ask, what of science? What of art? Do they not resent being timed by men in cassocks carrying velvet? They do. So we do not time them. We temper the room around their birth. A telescope is built in a year that needs a gentler winter. We buy the winter a new coat. A painter's hand shakes when a city cannot afford an angel. We sleeve the bell for 2 months and let courage sleep while technique wakes. We do not silence the dog. We teach the street when to applaud. In the concordance of errors, I found an entry that made me put my hand flat on the table, as one does when a ship sobers. It recorded a century, with a seam, a tidy splice, where 2 decades had been taught to kiss with their eyes closed. The reason was domestic, a series of inheritances that would have broken a noble house into beautiful, democratic poverty. We had not saved the rich, we had saved the city from a war it did not yet know how to finish. The price was a decade that woke several mornings uncertain of its own birthday. In the margin, in a hand I recognized as the archivist's when he was young, acceptable sadness. The cat, that uncredentialed regulator, developed a habit of standing on the paper when our sums turned prideful. She weighed only what was necessary, and the tokens under her paws returned to civility. She is our metronome, Taddeo said. And it was true. If we worked beyond decency, her tale would lie like a still sentence. If we honored the city's fatigue, she would choose to ignore us, whistling softly through her nose, the song of clean mechanics. There came a week, call it a corridor if you prefer, in which the lock refused us politely 3 nights in a row. We did nothing theatrical. We dusted the iron with flour from a baker we trusted. We oiled the teeth with a drop of repentance. We asked the bones to hum, and they offered us the minor key. The sky was not angry. It was occupied. An eclipse rehearsed its arc somewhere a continent away, and our city, not wishing to be provincial, chose to stand still in sympathy. We accepted the stillness and filed the inaction under chastened restraint. Sometimes, the only honest work is to watch without improving. When consent returned, it returned with a grace note. We heard it not in the vault, but on the domes, where the copper moves like a seasoned dancer. The miserere creaked a new chord, the red thread lifted without arrogance. The smoke beeswax, folded with soot and patience, curled clockwise with the fidelity of old friends. We did not open the porta non nata, not yet. We finished the long arithmetic of the city's breath and wrote the result as weather. I could taste the click before it happened, the joy of parts behaving as if they loved one another. That is how precision seduces. It offers you relief and calls it truth. Beware relief, Taddeo said again, smiling as a man smiles when an old warning keeps earning its bread. The archivist watched us with the affection of a surgeon who knows his students can close properly now, and therefore is ethically obligated to give them the difficult cases. He set the tin tablet on the shelf. The star rule revised with lines that crossed like avenues in a city designed by polite mathematicians. He touched the lock without turning it. He listened to the iron answer. He nodded. Once, a man negotiating with his own conscience. "We are ready," he said, "not for the calendar, not for the vault, but for the night whose door I had described and delayed and circled for 3 chapters of my life." Before we climbed, he told me a story he had never permitted himself before. "When I was your age," he said, "I believed we were saving souls from the embarrassment of contradictory dates. I thought accuracy was a virtue and tidiness next to faith. Then a woman came with a notebook of her grandfather's birthdays, 5 of them, each in a different decade, each correct. He had entered the city on 5 separate corridors. She asked me which was true. I told her the one that let her love him without envy. She closed the notebook and kissed my hand. That is the only absolution I have ever trusted. We carried the tools: thread, bell, water, smoke, key, pencil. The pencil last because numbers have appetites, and this night promised a banquet, At the top, Rome lay under us, like a dictionary, deciding which words to favor tomorrow. The cross hummed iron, the copper remembered fingers, the tin crackled with rumors already narrating their own correction. The cat arrived and ignored us, which I took as a blessing. We performed the listening, backs to the seam, 100 counted as if leading an old horse across a narrow bridge. At 71, a church discovered it had always had a back door. At 86, a memoir rearranged its chapter headings to ease a widow's complaint. At 99, a star forgot a name that would have started a war. At 100, the air had edges again, soft and decisive. Now, the archivist said, and did not touch the door. He touched the sky, palms up, fingers eased, the posture of a man who would catch a falling bowl and forgive it for being clumsy. Now, Taddeo said, and set the red thread across the seam as if crowning a child. Now, I said, and found I was not afraid, only accountable. We did not open. Not yet. The lock had been turned below. The houses had consented. The corridor was ready. But a lock is not a door. It is the idea of a door deciding to act. We stood in the small mercy that precedes a revision, the moment between breath and word, where the sentence can still apologize and choose another verb. Count backward, the archivist said, from 12. He rarely asked for this. Backward counting is confession, not management. We did it anyway, not to charm the mechanism, but to charm ourselves. 12 the houses that agree to be named. 11 the saints who forgive syntax. 10 the years that learn to be furniture. 9 the leap that saved a baker. 8 the grief we pretended to file cleanly. 7 the week we borrowed like a handkerchief. 6 the bell we taught to hide its pride. 5 the nights the city slept because we asked. 4 the coins paid to winter. 3 the doors that are corridors. 2 the lips that touch iron and do not kiss. 1 the click, not yet, almost, almost. The sky consented. You could hear it in the rails, in the gutters, in the miserly copper and the gossipy tin. You could smell it in the smoke twisting right as a penitent. You could feel it under the knuckles, where iron keeps its opinion. The celestial lock had turned. The calendar had learned new manners. A corridor had closed somewhere that did not belong to us, preserving a room that did. The city's pulse eased into a rhythm that will sound to you, if you are listening tomorrow, like weather. We did not open the door that night. Precision had bought us patience. Relief tempted us to spend it. Taddeo, fidgeting the way only carpenters do when the wood is ready, asked with his eyes if we should. The archivist, who had lived long enough to distrust poetry made of mechanics, shook his head once. We never spend a consent on the wrong question, he said. Tonight we have saved the hinge. Tomorrow we will ask the door. On the way down, the cat walked between us like a hyphen. The city invented dawn, as if to apologize for its anxieties. The baker's grandson set out chairs aggressively cheerful. A widow opened her notebook and found 5 birthdays settling into 2, neither less true than the other. A bus coughed itself into motion and learned to behave on the second try. I slept an hour and woke with soot in my creases and the taste of forgiveness on my tongue, the small, workable kind. Do I regret it? I regret the neatness when it masqueraded as goodness. I regret our shyness when courage would have named the harm plainly. I do not regret teaching bells to be modest, or asking smoke to report faithfully, or learning the exact weight of the sky's patience in my palm. If you need heroes, choose the men who will count backward when the room demands flattery. If you need villains, look for those who love the click more than the door. The celestial lock exists. It is old and honest and tired of our metaphors. It wants the same thing you want, a room where dates behave and grief finds a chair. It will lend you a corridor if you ask without vanity. It will not make you better. It will make you responsible. We are almost to the night you think you want, the storm that crawls on all fours, the portraits that blink, the mirror that offers replacements. Do not hurry. Opening is the smallest part of any door. The large, invisible part is the hinge learning whom it can carry without becoming cruel. Tonight we taught the hinge a virtue that sounds like boredom and behaves like mercy. Tomorrow we will ask the door to remember its own name. Storms do not arrive in Rome. They remember us. This one came crawling on all fours, claws of lightning finding old nail holes in the sky. The domes sweated. Copper trembled, as if a hand had hovered above it and changed its mind. We climbed early, lanterns hooded to a monk's discretion, sleeves coiled like tame serpents in our satchels, red thread on my wrist to remind the thread I was a person and not a rumor. The cross hummed iron through my bones. Tin tattled to copper. The wind spoke administrative Latin with a Florentine accent. It was a good night to break a rule. At the Miserere we paused, because habit is the brace that keeps courage from splitting. The city below us arranged its lights like proof. Fountains rehearsed their arguments. A bus practiced humility on the second turn. The archivist stood with his hand on the rail, as if feeling for the pulse of a patient about to elect surgery. Taddeo checked the sleeves, stroking velvet the way carpenters pet the wood that forgives them. The red thread lifted at the seam of the porta non nata with the arrogance of silk in love with its own story. "We open," the archivist said. He did not look at us when he said it. He looked at the city, the way a father looks at a sleeping child and decides not to spare him the medicine. "Once," he added. "If we strike twice, the city wakes up wrong." We laid the tools on the shelf carved into the breath of the wind. Order disciplines fear, thread, bell, water, smoke, key, pencil. The pencil last, always last. We washed our hands in moon water that smelled like interrupted prayer. We greased the knuckles with a memory of lamp oil. We spoke the integers without owning them, and the numbers behaved as if grateful not to be loved. "Listening," Taddeo said, and we sat with our backs to the seam and counted to 100 as slowly as men cross a rotten bridge. At 61, I heard the iron rehearse forgetting. At 79, I heard a saint cough between verses. At 88, I heard the calendar try to cry and then choose to be tidy. At 99, I heard the static of a sky learning to be polite. At 100, I heard nothing, and the nothing had borders. We stood. The hinge was warm, with a warmth not technical. Taddeo touched it with the backs of his fingers, as if greeting a fever that had decided to be civil. The archivist lifted the clapper meteor iron, wrapped in the red thread that refuses knots, and held it like a sentence he would rather not finish. Lightning walked its dog along the horizon. The bells below, sleeved, agreed to keep their opinions. "Open," the archivist said, and the seam smiled. Doors should swing. This one inhaled. The frame flexed soundlessly. There was no draft, no drama. The air leaned not forward but around us, thickening like honey taught to pretend to be light. A step presented itself that had never been part of the roof. It was the exact height of a decision. We stepped. Inside is a lie. There is no inside. There is only a corridor that fits itself to the shape of your hazard. It curved without turning, lit by lightning that could not commit to distance. Along its walls, if you insist on calling the constraint by a domestic name, hung portraits. Each wore papal white. Each face was unfinished. Eyes waiting for courage, mouths sketched in disapproval, skin toning itself like a choir before a mass. Beneath each portrait, a plaque with a name that apologized for existing, crossed out with a line exact as a surgeon's. Taddeo breathed the way men breathe when measuring wood, steadily, as if seconds could be plain to fit. "They are not men," he said. "They are attempts, drafts," the archivist corrected, because he never wasted the dignity of a noun. We walked. The corridor bent like a question repeated to a different child. The portraits blinked, not in unison but with the exhausted courtesy of bureaucrats. In one frame, a hand raised to bless, and could not decide whether to make a fist. In another, a ring glittered and dimmed as if embarrassed by its own authority. Somewhere behind us, Rome rearranged a sentence. I felt the adjustment as pressure in the ear, the way you feel a tunnel you are not in. At the corridor's end waited a mirror framed in bronze thorns. It did not reflect. It replaced. I saw myself 4 times. Me as loyal beyond reason, me as frightened into tidiness, me as hungry for the click more than the door, and me as very tired holding the clapper without the red thread. The archivist appeared only once, young, the way guilt remembers itself. Taddeo appeared twice, both of them with a carpenter's patience and a carpenter's mortality. "Pick carefully," the archivist said, as if we were choosing apricots. "One will be written, the rest will be forgotten." "How?" I asked, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted him to say the verb. "Revision," he said, too gently. The mirror wrinkled like water when prayer stands up from its knees and decides to be policy. I reached for the man with the tired mouth. He reached back, and I felt the meteor iron in his palm. It was warm, not from blood but from deciding. Taddeo reached for the version of himself whose hands trembled when they should have. The archivist, oh forgive him, I do, mostly reached for the ambitious boy who believed the lock would make him clean. The strike when it came was not thunder. It was the click of many small agreements made at once. Streets shifted, one paving stone to the left. The polite distance of men moving down a bench. A fresco downstairs acquired an angel whose wrist bent like a correction. A mathematician lost page 9 and gained patience. A statue in the piazza inhaled. A woman woke with the taste of a different birthday on her tongue and reached for water that had learned to be modest. In the library, a book shut itself with affection and another opened like apology. I thought, this is too neat. The mirror ceased to be water and became judgment. In it, my tired self nodded, as if grateful that I had spared him further zeal. The ambitious archivist washed his hands and dried them on a number. Taddeo's duplicate put the red thread around his wrist with a tenderness that forgives carpentry its splinters. Behind them, other selves arranged themselves into unhappened. We sealed the seam with smoke, beeswax folded with soot, pressed with the heel of a hand that remembered other wax and other soot. The smoke curled counterclockwise, the tail falling left, the way a sentence falls when it has been asked to be good. The archivist smiled, like a man relieved of the burden of honesty. "Clean," he said. "No one will notice." We noticed. On the way down, the domes hummed not with victory but with compliance. The miserere creaked into an obedient key. The cross offered iron like a handshake done properly. The cat did not come. Wind tried to learn humility, and failed. I kept waiting for relief to feel like virtue. It felt like anesthesia. At dawn, the square looked uninjured. A girl with a braid the city had not planned bought bread from a man who learned to be her father during the night. A police whistle chose a different pitch. A widow opened her notebook and watched 2 birthdays merge without sound, then closed the cover with the gratitude of someone spared an explanation. The fountain in the corner made the noise pages make when turned gently by tired hands. We slept the exhausted sleep of men who have trusted a mechanism. I woke to a quiet that mistook itself for good news. I went to the library and reached against sense for the gospel with my mother's voice. The chain hung with propriety. The label read, "Vacet." The dust remembered me remembering. In the bottom board of the bay, a carpenter's knife had once written a small complaint. "This shelf is tired of being correct." Someone had sanded it down. The smoothness felt like a bandage over a mouth. We convened in the nursery. The archivist unrolled the concordance of errors and found the line where last night should live. It read, "Door warmed, performed." Someone whose hand looked like mine on a day I would prefer to forget had added a notation of praise, the kind people write on the bottoms of good chairs. Taddeo set a fig on the table and did not touch it. He stared at the orrery until the teeth blushed. "We should count backward," he said. "From 12?" I asked. "From 1," he said, and his voice made the room learn honesty. 1, the click that cost a woman her certainty about a fountain. 0, the arrogance of thinking mercy balances like arithmetic. -1, the hour we will never know who paid. He smiled like a carpenter discovering the wood will not take a nail there. "Enough," he said, and left his fig for the cat. The cat did not eat it. She walked across the parchment, weighing tokens into decency, then sat squarely on the number that meant commendation. She blinked the slow blink of old queens, and looked at us as if to say, "You have behaved. Now learn not to enjoy it." We climbed again the following night, because the body insists on repetition where the soul would prefer remorse. The air had cooled its politics. The red thread lay like a line in a book you promise yourself you will not reread. We performed the listening. At 63, a schoolboy forgot a poem and discovered a joke. At 80, a lamp coughed and learned to behave. At 100, the nothing remained bordered, but the borders softened, like bread left on a windowsill to invite the neighborhood. We did not open. We walked the roofs as if apologizing to copper with our feet. We forgave a bell that wished to be helpful. We taught a hinge to accept oil from Thursday. Taddeo polished the shelf with the heel of his hand until the wind admired him. The archivist said nothing for so long I began to admire his silence. Then he spoke the truth I had been avoiding because I did not know how to hold it without breaking a window. "We did not save anything," he said. "We chose." And the room recorded the choice as cleanliness. "Is there a difference?" I asked, and hated the eagerness in my mouth. "Yes," he said. "Cleanliness insists on applause. Choice agrees to be lonely. We watched the city choose its lonelinesses. A saint's niche stayed empty and shone with the absent attention of 10,000 hands. A statue turned its gaze 3 degrees toward a window where a woman was teaching herself to forgive. A door that used to lock against boys did not. The night learned to hum in the key of what we had done. You want the costs, not the opulent ones, wars and crowns and operas, but the domestic invoice. A baker whose grandson now takes his nap at a different hour and will grow into a man who distrusts trains. A pair of lovers who learn to meet on Wednesdays because Tuesdays have become shy. A violin that refuses to hold tune in a room where a massacre was turned into an explanation of brickwork. We filed these things under acceptable sadness until the drawer would not close. Tadeo found a hairline crack along the miserere, fine as the line you draw when you promise not to cut. He pressed his ear to the copper and listened. Not structural, he said. Carpenter and priest, obedient to detail, but honest. He looked at me. Do you hear the honesty? I did. Honesty is a kind of friction. It makes the tool bite. It makes the joint complain truthfully. It refuses polish that would turn a chair into a museum piece no one sits on. The crack sounded like a voice, peeling itself away from a choir that had learned to be perfect at the price of interest. In the library, the whisperers modified their manners. The book that breathed like a sleeping animal now breathed like a woman who has decided to forgive herself without permission. The globe that mapped eras rather than continents slowed under my hand, as if the age of useful courage had been charged extra rent. The comb lifted a thread from a vellum page and laid it across my finger, the first letter of a name that used to have a shrine. The letter warmed my skin and left no mark. The archivist saw my face and pretended to straighten a stack of cards. When he finally spoke, he did not offer absolution. He offered work. We will return what we can, he said. Not a reversal. Never that. Returns. He pointed to the wall where brass tacks tarnish faster than hope. We will pin what is permitted. We will not congratulate ourselves. We tried. We adjusted a footnote to let a widow speak the right date without sounding mad. We moved a saint's procession half a street so the steps could remember the knees that had been erased. We unsleeved a bell for 3 slow tolls, the tempo of regret, and listened to the city admire itself less. Some nights we were allowed 1 return slip, some nights 2. Some nights the tax refused to grip. The wall is patient with grief. It despises vanity. Perhaps you want the mirror again what it offered if we had chosen differently? I go back to it in dreams, the way a man goes back to a conversation he should have. Lose more carefully. In the dream I take the clapper without the thread, and the strike is louder and cruder and honest in the way storms are honest. The city wakes wrong, but remembers it has woken wrong and writes songs. In another version, I pick the zealous self and become a hinge that cannot forgive itself for carrying the door. In another, the archivist picks himself, and the lock turns so cleanly that everyone lives tidily for 40 years and then cannot recognize their grandchildren's handwriting. I wake each time with the taste of iron and a cat's hair on my tongue. I make coffee and count backward from 12. What would you have had us do? Shut the door? Abandon the corridor purchased at such cost of consent? Let the baker wear sin and the bridge learn arrogance? You ask fair. I have no answer that does not bruise itself on the way out of my mouth. This is the cruelty of stewardship. The correct does not always feel righteous. That knowledge should make us gentle. It often makes us tired instead. We grew tired. The archivist lost weight the way men do when they are burning choices for fuel. Taddeo's laugh went to live in his tools. I developed a habit of standing in stairwells and listening to stone confess before it remembered the etiquette of silence. The cat took to sleeping on the tin tablet, pinning the star rule to the shelf until we promised not to revise it out of loneliness. And then, as cities do when they wish to show mercy to men who are about to be asked for something larger, Rome rained. A proper rain, not theatrical, solvent and clean, washing old soot into honest gutters. We climbed under it like children who have forgotten they can be ill. The copper slicked our palms. The miserere sang in the key of roof. The porta non nata cooled. We did not open that night. We did not even perform the listening. We counted forward for once, and the numbers did not bite. We sat on the shelf with our heels over centuries and watched water teach the air humility. The archivist took from his pocket a small card he had written years ago and never pinned, a name returned to itself. He held it the way men hold relics they have decided not to worship. "Tomorrow," he said, "if the wall allows." In the morning a woman stood at the fountain and did not grieve a birthday. She smiled at water as if recognizing a face that had taken a long way home. A bus stalled and started and laughed at itself. A child slept through a bell that had been unsleeved, then woke and told his mother that the city had sung him a story. The mother believed him without asking for dates. We came down from the roofs, changed in a way no mirror would bother to show. We were not better. We were not worse. We were answerable. I washed my hands and found the soot would not leave the creases. I left it there. I wanted to bring my work to the bread I would buy, to the coins I would miscount on purpose, so a boy could feel the arithmetic of kindness. I wanted my palms to say, "I touched the hinge and did not lie about it." That afternoon I returned to the library and opened a book at random to see if the room would allow me company. It was a register of petitions denied, requests to restore names, to alter feast days, to make history kinder to a grandfather who drank, to let a church keep the window that made a priest look noble in silhouette. The ink was unkind only in how clean it was. At the bottom of a page, much later than the entry deserved, a hand had added, "If they keep asking, perhaps we have not explained the hinge." I copied the sentence into my notebook and closed the book and did not put it back. I sat with it open until the chain learned to be patient. In the corner, the comb waited. I drew it through the vellum until static lifted. A thread caught again the first letter of a saint with no shrine, and this time I pressed it to the page, as if pinning down a small, frightened animal. "Stay," I said to no one human. The letter cooled. The page forgave me. The chain relaxed. The room's whisper thinned to the pleasant fatigue of furniture that knows it will be dusted tomorrow by men who love it enough to be clumsy. When night returned, we carried the tools as always. Thread, bell, water, smoke, key, pencil. The pencil last. Always last. We climbed with the calm of men convinced that calm is a choice. The porta non nata slept. The miserere creaked like a house that has stopped pretending not to be old. We performed the listening because we had missed it, counting like men who have learned that numbers can be kind when not worshipped. At 98, the air opened its hand and let us see what it held. The small cost of last night's restraint, 2 gutters that would need cleaning sooner, a quarrel that would last an extra hour and end in better tea, a poem that would arrive imperfect and therefore be memorized by 5 children. We accepted the invoice, we signed with the pencil, and did not cross out our names. The door does not forgive or accuse. It waits. We had opened it once and learned what a mirror does to men who think a corridor is a verdict. We would open it again. Mechanics guarantee as much, but not for the pleasure of precision dressed as salvation. The hinge had learned a new courtesy. So had we. When we descended, Taddeo pressed the fig into my hand, late and soft and sweeter for it. "Beware relief," he said, and smiled with his tools again. The archivist took the card from his pocket, a name returned to itself, and pinned it to the wall with a tack that tarnished before it cooled. The cat ignored us with the regal mercy of those who cannot be made to hurry. The city tried on its evening like a coat that still fit. Somewhere a bell complimented itself, and then, remembering what we had asked of it, blushed into silence. I tell you this so that when you hear the click in your own life, the small sound of parts consenting, you will count backward once before you celebrate, not to steal your joy, to give it honest weight, to see which hinge carried it, to notice who paid the coin. We are almost at the end of night, almost at the place where a corridor must describe itself aloud, and a city must admit it has been curated and decide to remember anyway. Almost at the sentence that turns management into memory. Almost at the call I will make to you not to believe me, not to worship the mechanism, but to keep a cheap notebook near your bed and write down what changes when you aren't looking. But that belongs to another chapter. Tonight, the door sleeps. The hinge forgives. The sky pretends to be furniture. And I, who once loved the click more than the room, carry the weight of a fig and the luxury of a slow descent, and I say out loud, to no one who can be blamed for hearing it, we did not save the city. We stayed to witness how it saves itself when we stop improving it. Dawn is a patient argument. It does not win, it persists until the room agrees there was never a debate. After the night of the door and the soft, solvent rain that washed us back into ourselves, the city learned a quieter grammar. Bells remembered modesty without sleeves. Copper accepted fingerprints as compliments. The miserere creaked like a house relieved of guests. We reset the tools onto their pegs, thread sleeping in its tin, the meteor clapper resting like a cooled verb, the pencil placed last, as if the drawer had learned shame. I left, not with a slammed door but with a hinge's courtesy. Resignation that isn't angry is a kind of faith. I handed back the ring of keys. The archivist received them with the same calm he would use to accept a confession he had already heard in the air. "You will hear us anyway," he said. "Rooms you have worked in, keep your breath." He set the keys on the table, as if freeing them from service, and added, almost kind, "Try to love the click less." Taddeo walked me to the stairs the way carpenters walk visitors through a finished room, palms open, understanding that touch is the final inspection. He gave me a fig. "Fruits are honest," he said. "Dates can be trained." He clasped my forearm, that old soldier's grip, and did not say goodbye. We are not a culture of farewells. We are a culture of nods that expect you to keep your shape when you step into another light. I tried to become a civilian. Civility is a set of courtesies practiced toward ignorance. It is also a mercy. I bought bread, and coins miscounted themselves politely into honesty. I sat beside a fountain that had relearned its face and watched a child hit the surface with her palm, convincing the city to clap. I walked the streets like a man who has agreed not to rearrange them without consent. I managed 2 days. On the third, I woke to the absence of a date and knew which hinge had carried it. Once taught, the ear does not forget the click. So I wrote. The first night I wrote what you have heard. The roofs that taught me to distribute my weight, so stone would forgive. The chained library that trained whisper into discipline. The lock that wanted only consent. The door that inhaled. The mirror that offered replacements with the calm cruelty of furniture. The ledger that filed our appetite as cleanliness. The wall where a name returned to itself and tarnished a tack like a small, decent storm. When the words misbehaved, I let them. Honesty is a friction you must allow. I wrote until my hand smelled of lamp oil and the paper tasted of rain on iron. At the end of the third night, I understood why the archivist did not forbid me. Prohibitions are loud. Admission is quieter and more effective. Say it, he had always taught without saying. The city will decide what to keep. If you lie, it will remove you. If you tell a truth that lacks mercy, it will comb you into a statistic. If you tell a truth with mercy, it will pin you to the wall with tarnished brass and call you a return. I returned to the library once, disarmed of privilege. Visitors queue differently when they think the room is theirs by right. I wore no cassock, no key weight in my pocket. Only the stains that won't wash from creases because wax remembers the warmth of your hands. The attendant did not recognize me. The chains did. They warmed the way cats warm to old friends, not fawning, not aloof, just the temperature of recognition. I found the breviary with the tables that teach the moon bureaucracy. Someone had glued a polite notice to the flyleaf in multiple languages. Please do not trace the charts with your finger. The paper is elderly. I did not touch. I let my eyes do the tracing and felt the old arithmetic settle, not as power but as posture. Alignment is a way of standing up without apologizing to your skeleton. I checked the shelf where the gospel with my mother's voice had been. Vacant remained formal, unembarrassed vacancy. But the dust had gathered into a shallow U-shape, as if the shelf were a mouth practicing the sound of a name. In the corner of the bay, the carpenter's knife scratch had grown faint again. A novice's hand had sanded it. Another novice's hand, later, had stopped sanding because the room prefers an honest floorboard to a lie with a gloss. The archivist met me in the corridor where sound is born naked. He did not say, "You came back." He said, "The wall has room for one more tack." It is the kindness of a miser, clean, exact, effective. He led me to the board, where we pin returns. The brass brackets slept in rows, dulling themselves into humility. He held out a card. It read, "A habit given its name." "For what?" I asked. "For writing instead of filing," he said. "For teaching the door to live outside the vault." He handed me the tack. I pinned the card. It darkened quickly, as if the wall were tired of bright claims. When I stepped back, I saw that someone had pinned another card earlier that morning. A bell learned to forgive its own pride. The cat had signed it with a hair caught under the brass. I asked for my oath back, not to repudiate it, to hold it in daylight and see if it still fit. The archivist did what he always did with questions that wished to be verbs. He made me work. We walked the old route, lightning seam, miserere, cross, mouth. The city, pausing between languages, listened. He set the tools on the shelf. As a father lays cutlery in front of a child and watches to see if the child will pretend a fork is a sword. Thread, bell, water, smoke, key, pencil, the pencil last. Always last. Say the integers, he said, and refuse to own them. I counted forward and backward until numbers learned hospitality. Then he gave me the old oath, the one written in an alphabet that counts you. He did not make me sign. He let me read it aloud until the letters grew bored of their tricks and consented to mean what they had meant for men who had meant well. When I finished, he took the paper back and burnt it with the gentlest match I have ever seen. Flame behaved itself. Ash did not travel. There, he said, now no one can ask you to break it. You have already kept it. How did I become the man speaking into your room at an hour designed to pardon tiredness? Incrementally. Resignations are stairs, not cliffs. I began with a notebook under a lamp that gave up more light than it could afford. Then a microphone found its way to my table, the way cups find hands. Then the habit of counting backward before I say anything I might have to file later. Then the small domestic liturgy that keeps this from becoming performance. Dim the lights, unsleeve the bell inside my voice. Speak the integers without owning them. Invite the hinge to carry what it can. Then you. I have not asked you to believe me. Belief is a date. It can be shifted, backfilled, corrected with kindly arithmetic. I am asking for something cheaper and more durable. Attention. Keep a small notebook near your bed. When the night changes its mind in your house, when a stair creaks where it never did because a child elsewhere has decided to live, when the kettle takes one heartbeat longer because a city across an ocean unlearned a war, when a bell rings and you hear it in your wrist, write it down. Do not chase it. Note it. Tomorrow, see which details raise their heads for roll call. The ones that flee are rumors. The ones that stay are your education. If you pray, pray for hinges. Doors are theatrical. Hinges are loyal. When you light a candle, teach the air the dignity of old beeswax. If you must count, count backward once before you celebrate the click. Not to dampen joy, but to weigh it honestly. What carried this and what paid? When someone offers you certainty, ask for their ladder. See if it wobbles under pretension. Ladders prefer confession. Do not be seduced by cleanliness when it tries on goodness as a borrowed suit. Polishing is a sacrament only when it refuses to erase. A shelf is allowed to admit tiredness. A city is allowed to remember badly for a season if the remembering teaches tenderness. When you hear a story that makes you admire your own side for being tidy, find the cat. She will sit on the number that wants applause and teach you to breathe until you can hear the furniture complain truthfully. You want a ritual. Humans always do when the room grows too large. Here is one that costs no tithe and offends no sky. Dim the room. Not to make it holy, only humble. Place a notebook within reach. Not beautiful, obedient. Find a small sound, a refrigerator hum, a street's faded vowel, the after ring of a neighbor's cup. Call it your bell. Sleeve it with your attention. Count to 100 slowly, as if walking an old horse across a narrow bridge. At each 10, ask one decent question. Who benefits? Who is spared? Who is asked to carry? Where is the hinge? Write one line that begins, "Tonight, the city," and end it with something unimportant that you are secretly relieved is true. Close the notebook. Pin nothing, tarnish nothing, sleep. In the morning, if your day offers you a fountain real or municipal, memory or plumbing, stand beside it, and admit which birthday your tongue is carrying. If it is not the date on your papers, forgive your tongue. It learned its calendar at the breast. If you are offered a missing decade to explain a family's undramatic survival, accept it like a fig. Sweetness is not a sin when it is honest about being late. You ask, perhaps, whether the lock endures, whether the library still trains whisper into discipline, whether the door is opening without me to make the old apology. Yes, mechanisms outlive witnesses, but consent is a living currency. The houses in the vault will not turn for men who love applause more than hinges. The chains will not warm for hands that stroke them the way a thief praises a purse. The door inhales at the same temperature as a mother saying a child's name without making it small. If you keep attention, you are already part of the mechanism that refuses cruelty dressed as accuracy. Taddeo is older. Carpentry ages a man honestly. He still says beware relief, as if handing you a tool and trusting you not to bleed on the ledger. Sometimes he sends me a note on stiff paper that smells like treated wood. There is never gossip, only measurements. Miserere sound. Copper compliant. Agnes took Sunday oil with grace. News for men who have loved a roof. The archivist grows thin. Choose your kindness carefully around thin men. They are spending themselves on the room's behalf. He writes less now and listens more, which was always his better art. When he laughs, paper relaxes. The cat Signora Calendaria by Taddeo's blasphemous affection owns the domes. One night, she followed a tourist's drone with a look that made the machine reconsider its doctrine. Another, she sat with dignity on the red thread and prevented a boy's dare from becoming a legend with sharp edges. She ignores us when we are acceptable. She forgives us when we are precise without cruelty. She sleeps on the tin tablet and leaves hair that teaches arrogance manners. And you are where the room is moving. Cities are always exporting their hinges into human mouths. Keep yours quiet when tempted to congratulate yourself for knowing secret things. Secrets are dates in costume. Knowledge that makes you gentler has already passed its first test. Knowledge that asks you to sort people into tidy shelves will rattle its own chain by morning. I am nearly finished. The light in your room is doing that off-duty thing that makes lamps look guilty for having worked all day. The noise outside has arranged itself into a pulse your bones can forgive. Before I leave you, let me give you the last sound that matters. Not the click, not the sigh of a corridor closing with decency. The scratch of a pencil, practicing the number for apology. I keep it near. I use it often. It behaves. I will not tell you to trust me. Trust is a church word with too many candles. I will tell you to practice noticing. If tomorrow feels familiar in a way you cannot place, count backward from 12. If a bell rings where no bell is, sleeve it with a moment. If a date insists on being righteous, ask it where it keeps its broom. If silence presents itself as sacred, press 2 wet fingers and turn your wrist. See whether the flame dies without smoke. See whether the room inhales your quiet. If it does, insist on breathing anyway. And if anything I have said brushes a memory you have been polite enough to misplace, do not chase it. Note it. Put a tack through the smallest card that names it, and pin it where you keep the ordinary magnificence of your days. Let the brass tarnish. Let your wall become a concordance of returns. When someone you love asks what you are collecting, say, hinges. They will laugh if they are young. They will touch the card if they are wise. They will count backward with you if they are kind. Silence was not sacred. It was enforced. Memory is not rebellion. It is housekeeping that refuses to lie. Call to action, soft, practical. Keep a small notebook by your bed. Each night, write one line that begins, "Tonight the city." Don't aim for proof. Aim for precision with mercy. Question dates that arrive too clean. Touch old stones. When a bell rings, ask who holds the clapper. And when the world clicks, count backward once. Then carry that hinge into the daylight and use it to open your next decent question. Don't stop asking.